Hey guys, tonight we delve into the hidden chronicles of House Targaryen, the dragon lords whose true history has been buried beneath centuries of conquest, madness, and glory. These are the stories that were never written in the Meister's books, the secrets that shaped the fate of Westeros from the shadows, and the ancient prophecies that guided every crown from Aegon's conquest to the breaking of the wheel. We're talking about mysteries that connect the doom of Valyria to the return of the Long Night, blood magic rituals that determined which Targaryens could truly command dragons, and the cosmic forces that made House Targaryen not just conquerors, but guardians of reality itself. This isn't just about dragons and thrones. This is about the ancient powers that flow through Valyrian blood and the terrible burden of prophecy that drove the Dragon Kings to madness and greatness in equal measure. So before you settle in for this epic journey through 4 centuries of hidden history, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Deep beneath Dragonstone, in chambers that predate even the Targaryen arrival in Westeros, there exists a vault that no maester has ever catalogued. The walls are carved from volcanic glass that pulses with its own inner fire, and etched into the obsidian are symbols that match those found in the deepest ruins of old Valyria. These aren't decorations, they're warnings. In the center of this forgotten chamber stands a pedestal of black stone, and upon it rests a single tome. Its pages are made not of parchment, but of scales from the first dragons to serve House Targaryen. The book's cover bears no title in any known tongue, only a sigil that seems to shift and change in the flickering torchlight, a 3-headed dragon with eyes that burn like stars. This is the chronicle of blood and prophecy, and it has remained sealed for over a century, until tonight. The first entry, written in High Valyrian script that seems to glow faintly in the darkness, speaks of a dreamer who saw the end of everything, not just the end of her family, not just the end of Valyria, but the end of the world itself. And in that vision of ultimate darkness, she saw something that made her weep tears of molten silver. She saw that her bloodline would be the key to preventing it. The dreamer's name was Daenerys, and her vision came exactly 12 years before the doom consumed the greatest civilization the world had ever known. But here's what the histories don't tell you. Daenerys didn't just see the destruction of Valyria, she saw what would rise from its ashes. She saw ice creeping south like a tide of death. She saw the stars going out one by one, and she saw dragons falling from the sky like burning tears. Most importantly, she saw that House Targaryen's exile to Dragonstone wasn't an escape, it was a positioning, a chess move, in a game that spanned centuries, played against an enemy that existed beyond the wall, beyond the known world, beyond comprehension itself. The second page of the chronicle reveals something that would have shattered the faith of the Seven and rewritten every history book in Westeros. Aegon the Conqueror didn't invade the 7 kingdoms for glory or gold, or even for the love of his sister wives. He came because of a prophecy that told him that from his bloodline would come a prince or princess who would unite the realm against a darkness that would consume everything. The prophecy had a name: the Song of Ice and Fire, and Aegon believed it so completely that he was willing to burn half the continent to ensure his descendants would sit the Iron Throne when the Long Night returned. But here's where the story takes a turn that even the wisest maesters never suspected. The prophecy wasn't about one prince. It was about three heads of the dragon, each representing a different aspect of the coming war. One to rule, one to lead, and one to sacrifice everything. The chronicle's 3rd page contains a passage that would have driven King Robert to madness with rage. It speaks of a pact signed in blood beneath the heart tree of Winterfell between Torrhen Stark and Aegon Targaryen. The Stark who knelt didn't just surrender his crown. He swore an oath that his bloodline would stand with the dragons when the ancient enemy returned. He swore that a Stark would always be ready to stand beside a Targaryen when the world needed saving. The king in the north didn't kneel because he was afraid of dragons. He knelt because he could see the future in the flames of the heart tree, and he knew that the real war was still centuries away. As we turn the pages of this ancient tome, we begin to understand that every major event in Westerosi history was connected. The Dance of Dragons wasn't just a civil war, it was a test to see which bloodline could command the loyalty of the dragons when the final battle came. The Blackfire rebellions weren't about legitimacy, they were about ensuring the right Dragonlord would sit the throne when prophecy demanded it. Even Robert's rebellion, devastating as it was, served a purpose that neither Robert nor Aerys could have understood. The Targaryens who seemed mad weren't mad at all. They were seers, burdened with visions of a future so terrible that it drove them to desperate acts. Aerys the Kai didn't want to burn King's Landing out of spite. He wanted to burn it because he saw that one day the city would be overrun by ice and shadow, and he thought fire was the only way to save it. Rhaegar Targaryen didn't abandon his wife and children because he was in love with Lyanna Stark. He did it because he saw that the prince who was promised would be born from ice and fire, from the union of dragon and wolf, and he was willing to be remembered as a villain if it meant saving the world. But the most chilling entry in the Chronicles speaks of something that hasn't happened yet. A passage written in silver ink that seems to move across the page like living mercury. It speaks of the last dragon, the one who would break the wheel and end the Game of Thrones forever. It speaks of the three-eyed raven and the Night King, of a throne made of swords and a crown made of winter roses. And it speaks of a choice that will determine whether the sun rises again or whether the long night becomes eternal. The Chronicle tells us that the Targaryens weren't just conquerors or rulers, they were guardians. Guardians of a secret so dangerous that it could only be whispered in the deepest vaults of Dragonstone, where the volcanic glass remembers the first dragons and the obsidian keeps the memories of old Valyria. They were the watchers on the wall that no one else could see. The wall between the world of men and the realm of endless winter, between the light of dragons and the darkness that waits beyond the edge of all maps. And as we close the first section of this ancient tome, we realize that the true Game of Thrones was never about who would sit the Iron Throne. It was about who would be strong enough to destroy it when the time came. Who would be willing to sacrifice everything, including their own bloodline, to ensure that spring would come again. The obsidian walls of the chamber seemed to pulse with a deeper rhythm now, like the heartbeat of a sleeping dragon. The torches burn lower, casting longer shadows that dance with secrets yet to be revealed. And somewhere in the darkness we can hear the whisper of ancient flames, telling us that the real story is just beginning. Because in the chronicle of blood and prophecy, every ending is just the beginning of something far more magnificent and terrible than anyone could have imagined. Tonight we turn the page and step into the shadows of history, where dragons dream of ice and fire, and the fate of the world hangs in the balance of a single choice that hasn't been made yet, but will be made soon. In the final decades before the Doom, the freehold of Valyria had grown drunk on its own power. 40 families of dragonlords ruled an empire that stretched across half the known world, their dragons and sorcery making them seem like gods to lesser men. But among the obsidian towers and sulfur-scented streets of the capital, a few families had begun to sense the approaching catastrophe. The Targaryens were not the most powerful of the Dragonlord families. That distinction belonged to the Valyrians of the sea and the Ballyrians of the ancient bloodlines. A House Targaryen was known for something far more valuable and dangerous: their dreamers. Every generation of Targaryens produced at least one child blessed with the gift of prophetic dreams. While other families bred for stronger dragons or more potent sorcery, the Targaryens cultivated their connection to the realm of visions and shadows. They understood that in a world where magic could reshape reality, knowledge of the future was the ultimate weapon. Daenerys Targaryen was 12 years old when the first dream came to her. She woke screaming in her bedchamber high in the Dragonmont Tower, her silver hair damp with sweat and her violet eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't the vision of Valyria's destruction that had driven her to such despair. It was what she saw beyond the flames. In her dream, she stood on the highest peak of the 14 Flames, watching as the molten rock erupted skyward in pillars of fire and smoke. The dragons of the 40 families circled overhead, their riders trying desperately to escape the catastrophe. But as the ash fell like snow and the ground cracked open to reveal rivers of lava, Daenerys saw something that none of the historical accounts would ever record. The destruction of Valyria wasn't an accident, it was a summoning. Deep beneath the volcanic peaks, something ancient had been stirring. Something that had slumbered since the first men walked the earth, waiting for enough magical energy to gather in one place. The Dragon Lords, in their arrogance, had built their empire directly above the prison that held this entity. And with each passing year, each new dragon hatched, each spell cast, they had been feeding it power. When Daenerys told her father Aenir about the dream, she didn't speak of fleeing Valyria. She spoke of preparing for what would come after. Because in her vision she had seen the thing beneath the 14 Flames break free from its ancient bonds. She had seen it stretch tendrils of ice and shadow across the world, reaching toward the lands beyond the narrow sea. She had seen it heading for Westeros. Adenna Targaryen was a man who understood the weight of prophecy. Unlike his contemporaries who dismissed dreams as the fantasies of children, he knew that the Targaryen gift came with a terrible price. Every true vision demanded action, no matter how impossible it seemed. So when his daughter told him that they must leave Valyria and establish a stronghold in the west, he didn't question her. He began to plan. The Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy records that Aenir spent 5 years preparing for their exodus. But he wasn't just gathering ships and provisions. He was collecting something far more precious: knowledge. From the great library of Valyria, he took scrolls that detailed the binding rituals used to control dragons. From the temples of the fire priests, he acquired texts that explained the connection between dragonfire and the cosmic forces that shaped the world. Most importantly, from the deepest vaults of the Dragon Lord families, he stole the breeding records that would allow him to preserve the pure Valyrian bloodline. Because Daenerys had seen something else in her prophetic dreams. She had seen that the thing beneath Valyria could only be defeated by dragons. But not just any dragons. Dragons born from the purest bloodlines. Creatures whose fire burned hot enough to melt the ice that would one day threaten the world. The Targaryens weren't fleeing Valyria. They were positioning themselves for a war that wouldn't begin for another 4 centuries. When the family finally sailed west with their 5 dragons, they left behind a Valyria that was already showing signs of the coming catastrophe. The lesser dragons had begun to refuse their riders. The flames in the great forges burned cold, and in the slave pits where the Dragon Lords tested their magic, strange shadows had begun to move without any source of light to cast them. But Aenir Targaryen had seen these signs before, not with his eyes but through his daughter's dreams, and he knew that Valyria's doom would be swift when it finally came. Dragonstone, the island fortress that would become their new home, had been chosen for reasons that went far beyond its strategic location. The volcanic rock from which the castle was carved contained the same obsidian that lined the deep places of Valyria. More importantly, it sat at the exact point where the magical currents of Essos and Westeros converged. From the highest tower of Dragonstone, a dragon rider could see across the narrow sea to the lands their ancestors had abandoned. But more importantly, they could see north toward the wall that held back the darkness beyond the edge of the world. Daenerys had chosen Dragonstone because her dreams had shown her that when the long night returned, this island would be the last place where dragonfire could be rekindled. The volcanic forges beneath the castle would be needed to birth the 3 dragons that would save the world, and the obsidian walls would be the only thing strong enough to contain the power that would be required for their hatching. The doom of Valyria came exactly 12 years after Daenerys first dreamed of it. The 14 flames erupted simultaneously, creating an explosion that could be seen from 1,000 miles away. The empire that had ruled the known world for centuries was destroyed in a single day. Tens of thousands of dragons died in the flames, along with all the knowledge and power their riders had accumulated over generations. But from their tower on Dragonstone, the Targaryens watched the distant glow on the eastern horizon and knew that the first phase of the prophecy had been fulfilled. The thing beneath Valyria had been released, and now it would begin its slow journey toward Westeros. They had perhaps 400 years to prepare. The chronicle records that in the years following the doom, Daenerys continued to have prophetic dreams. But these visions were different from the first. Instead of showing her distant catastrophes, they revealed the intricate web of events that would need to unfold for the world to survive what was coming. She saw a conqueror who would unite the 7 kingdoms under a single crown. She saw the bloodline that would need to be preserved through centuries of war and madness. She saw the 3 dragons that would be born from death and the 3 riders who would command them in the final battle. Most importantly, she saw that the Targaryens would need to become something more than dragon lords. They would need to become the memory of the world, keeping alive the knowledge of how to fight an enemy that most people couldn't even imagine. The secret archives beneath Dragonstone began to fill with more than just Valyrian texts. Ananar and his descendants collected every scrap of information they could find about the Long Night, the Others, and the ancient pacts that had ended the first war between ice and fire. They corresponded secretly with the Night's Watch, learning everything they could about what lay beyond the wall. They discovered that the thing that had been imprisoned beneath Valyria was not unique. It was part of something larger, something that had been trying to break into the world since the dawn of time. And they learned that the only way to defeat it was with the combined power of ice and fire, winter and summer, the old gods and the new. This knowledge came at a terrible cost. Each generation of Targaryens produced dreamers who were driven to madness by the weight of what they saw. Some, like Prince Arryn Brightflame, were consumed by visions of fire and convinced themselves they could become dragons. Others, like King Aerys II, saw the future so clearly that they could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was yet to come. But the Targaryens endured because they understood that their madness served a purpose. Each mad king, each twisted prince, each dreamer who died young had seen a piece of the great pattern that would determine the fate of the world. And as the years passed, and the wheel of history turned, the descendants of Daenerys the Dreamer prepared for the war that their ancestor had foreseen. They conquered Westeros, not for glory, but to unite it. They bred dragons, not for power, but for the battle to come. They preserved their bloodline, not out of vanity, but because they knew that when the darkness returned, only the blood of old Valyria would be strong enough to kindle the fires that would drive it back. The thing beneath the 14 flames had been patient for millennia. It could wait a few centuries more. But the dragons were coming, and when they arrived, the real war would finally begin. Aegon Targaryen was 27 years old when he received the dream that would change the course of history. Unlike his ancestor Daenerys, whose visions came to her in sleep, Aegon's prophecy revealed itself while he stood in the chamber of the painted table, studying maps of the 7 kingdoms by candlelight. The flame of a single candle began to dance without any wind to move it. The wax melted upward instead of down, forming shapes that spelled out words in High Valyrian, and in those burning letters, Aegon read the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. From my blood come the prince that was promised, and his will be the song of ice and fire. The vision that followed was unlike anything recorded in the chronicle before. Aegon saw himself not as a conqueror, but as a gardener, planting seeds that would grow into a great tree whose branches would shelter the world from an endless winter. He saw the Iron Throne not as a seat of power, but as an anchor point for magic that would bind the Seven Kingdoms together when unity became their only hope of survival. Most crucially, he saw that his conquest would set in motion a chain of events that would culminate centuries later in a single moment of choice, a choice that would determine whether the sun would rise again or whether darkness would cover the world forever. But Aegon's vision revealed something that even Daenerys had not foreseen. The enemy that threatened the world was not a single entity. It was part of a cosmic balance that had existed since the creation of the world itself. Ice and fire, light and shadow, order and chaos. These forces had been locked in an eternal struggle, and humanity existed in the narrow space between them. The thing that had been released from beneath Valyria was the champion of ice and shadow, and if it was to be defeated, fire and light would need their own champion. A prince or princess born from a bloodline that carried the essence of both extremes. The Song of Ice and Fire was not a prophecy. It was a recipe. When Aegon shared his vision with his sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, they understood immediately what it meant. The Targaryen conquest of Westeros would not be about building an empire. It would be about creating the conditions necessary for the birth of a savior. But first, they would need to forge an alliance that had never existed before. An alliance between fire and ice, between dragon and wolf, between the old magic of Valyria and the ancient power of the First Men. The war that followed was unlike any conquest in recorded history. While the histories speak of Aegon's military genius and the terror of his dragons, they miss the deeper purpose behind every battle, every negotiation, every act of mercy or cruelty. When Aegon burned Harrenhal, he wasn't just demonstrating the power of dragonfire, he was purifying a place where dark magic had taken root, clearing the way for the light magic that would one day be needed there. When he spared Torrhen Stark and accepted his submission, he wasn't just avoiding a costly battle, he was forging a pact that would bind the Stark bloodline to the Targaryens for all time. The ceremony where Torrhen knelt before Aegon took place beneath the heart tree of Winterfell, witnessed only by the old gods and the ancient stones. But the chronicle reveals that more than submission was sworn that day. In words spoken in the old tongue, Torrhen Stark pledged that his blood would answer when the dragons called, that his descendants would stand with fire against ice when the final battle came. In return, Aegon swore that when the Long Night returned, a Targaryen would give their life to ensure that a Stark could fulfill their part of the bargain. This was the true pact of ice and fire, and it was sealed not with signatures on parchment, but with drops of blood from both men mixed beneath the watching eyes of the weirwood. The Iron Throne itself was forged with purpose that went far beyond symbolism. The 1,000 swords that Aegon melted down to create his seat of power were not chosen randomly. Each blade had been wielded in battle against the others during the first Long Night. Each piece of steel carried within it the memory of Winter's defeat. But more than memory, the throne carried power. Valyrian steel was not just strong because of how it was forged. It was strong because it contained within its metal the essence of dragonfire, the one force that could pierce the heart of Winter itself. By melting down 1,000 such blades and reshaping them into a single seat, Aegon created a focal point for magic that would grow stronger with each Targaryen who sat upon it. The throne was not meant to be comfortable. It was meant to be a conduit, a place where the blood of dragons could touch the ancient power of the steel and channel it toward a single purpose. Every cut the throne gave its occupant, every drop of royal blood that fell upon its edges, was another link in a chain of power that would one day be needed to bind the darkness. This is why the throne rejected so many who tried to claim it. It was not made for mere kings and queens. It was made for the blood of old Valyria, and it would only accept those whose lineage carried the fire necessary to activate its true purpose. The establishment of King's Landing was equally purposeful. The city was built at the exact confluence of 3 rivers, at a point where the magical currents of Westeros converged most strongly. Beneath the Red Keep, Aegon ordered the construction of chambers that mirrored those found beneath Dragonstone, halls carved from dragon glass, vaults lined with Valyrian steel, and at the very heart of it all, a room that could only be opened by dragonfire. In this hidden chamber, Aegon placed the most precious artifacts that had been saved from the doom of Valyria, dragon eggs that had never hatched but still contained the potential for life, scrolls that detailed the deepest secrets of dragon breeding and training, and most importantly, a second copy of the Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy, so that if Dragonstone fell, the knowledge would not be lost. But the Chronicle in King's Landing contained additional pages that were not found in the original, pages that Aegon wrote himself, detailing the visions that had driven him to conquest. And on the final page, written in his own blood, was a prophecy that he dared not speak aloud. When the dead rise and the living weep, when ice creeps south and the sun grows cold, the 3 heads of the dragon shall wake from stone. One shall rule, one shall fight, and one shall die for love. And in their sacrifice, the world shall be reborn. The 3 heads of the dragon. This was the secret that Aegon carried with him to his grave. The knowledge that his conquest was not the end of the Targaryen purpose, but merely the beginning, that his bloodline would need to produce not 1, but 3 champions, and that these 3 would need to work together to fulfill a destiny that would require the ultimate sacrifice. As Aegon's reign progressed, he began to understand more fully what his vision had shown him. The prophecy was not just about his distant descendants, it was about the entire structure of reality, about the cosmic forces that kept the world in balance. Ice and fire were not enemies. They were partners in an eternal dance, each keeping the other from growing too strong. But something had happened to upset this balance. The release of the entity from beneath Valyria had given ice a champion of unimaginable power. If fire did not produce an equally powerful response, the balance would be broken forever. The long night that threatened the world was not just a season of cold and darkness, it was the universe itself beginning to tip toward one extreme, toward a state where life itself would become impossible. This was why the Targaryens had to rule, not because they were superior to other men, but because they were the only ones who carried within their blood the fire necessary to restore the balance. Their dragons were not weapons of conquest. They were antibodies, created by magic itself to fight off an infection that threatened all of creation. But the prophecy also revealed the terrible cost that would be required. To birth the 3 champions that the world would need, the Targaryen bloodline would have to be tested again and again. Wars would come that would seem to tear the family apart. Madness would claim those who saw too much of the future. Love would be sacrificed on the altar of duty, and duty would be sacrificed for love. The Dance of Dragons, the Blackfire Rebellions, the tragedy at Summerhall, Robert's Rebellion, the exile of the last Targaryens to Essos. All of these catastrophes were not accidents or failures. They were necessary steps in a process that would eventually produce the 3 heads of the dragon that the prophecy demanded. And Aegon, first of his name, conqueror of the 7 kingdoms, understood that he would be remembered as a great king, but the true heroes of the story would be his descendants who would pay the ultimate price for the world's salvation. As he sat upon his throne of swords, feeling the metal bite into his flesh and tasting his own blood on his lips. Aegon Targaryen knew that he had done what was necessary. The seeds were planted. The stage was set. The cosmic forces were aligned. Now all that remained was for time to pass, for the wheel to turn, and for the song of ice and fire to play itself out to its inevitable conclusion. The realm was united under the dragon's wing. The pact with the wolves was sealed in blood and witnessed by the old gods. The Iron Throne stood ready to channel the power that would one day be needed. And deep beneath King's Landing, in chambers that would not be opened for centuries, the tools for humanity's salvation waited in patient darkness for the moment when they would be needed. The conquest was complete, but the real war had not yet begun. In the years following Aegon's conquest, as the Seven Kingdoms settled into an uneasy peace under Targaryen rule, a disturbing truth began to emerge from the depths of Dragonstone. Not all who carried Targaryen blood could bond with dragons, and those who could not were dying in ways that defied explanation. The first sign came during the reign of Aegon's son, Aenys I. Prince Aegon the Uncrowned, heir to the Iron Throne, had been trying for months to claim a dragon of his own. Quicksilver, his father's mount, had accepted him readily enough. But when the young prince attempted to bond with one of the newly hatched dragonlings from the clutch laid by Balerion and Vhagar, something went terribly wrong. The dragon, a magnificent creature with scales the color of polished silver, had seemed eager to accept the prince. But the moment Aegon touched its snout in the traditional bonding ritual, both prince and dragon screamed in agony. The dragon's silver scales turned black as charcoal, and it died within moments. Prince Aegon survived, but his hair had turned completely white, and his eyes, once the traditional Targaryen violet, had become pale as winter ice. The maesters declared it an accident, a tragedy brought on by the dragon's sickness. But in the hidden archives of Dragonstone, older texts told a different story. The bonding between dragon and rider was not just about bloodline or courage. It was about something far more fundamental, something written into the very fabric of their souls. The dragons, these texts revealed, were not merely beasts trained to serve House Targaryen. They were magical constructs, created by the dragon lords of old Valyria, through rituals that bound the creatures to the cosmic forces that shaped reality. Each dragon contained within its fire a fragment of the power that kept the world in balance between ice and flame. But this power came with a price. Only those whose blood contained the proper resonance could safely bond with a dragon, and that resonance was not something that could be inherited like eye color or the shape of one's nose. It was earned through suffering, through exposure to the raw forces of magic that most mortals could not survive. The Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy contained detailed records of the binding rituals used in old Valyria to determine which children of the Dragonlord families would be capable of riding. These were not gentle ceremonies. They were trials that tested not just the child's courage, but their very soul's capacity to contain dragonfire without being consumed by it. The ritual began at the age of 7, when Targaryen children would be brought to the Chamber of Binding deep beneath Dragonmont. The chamber was carved from a single piece of obsidian, polished to mirror smoothness, and heated by vents that connected directly to the volcanic fires below. At the center of the chamber stood a pedestal holding a single dragon egg, one that had never hatched despite decades of careful tending. The child would be left alone in the chamber for 3 days and 3 nights, with only the egg for company. They were given no food, no water, no comfort of any kind. They were told that if they were worthy, the dragon within the egg would speak to them. If they were not, they would never leave the chamber alive. Most children who entered the Chamber of Binding emerged, changed. Some came out with their eyes permanently altered, pupils that reflected dragonfire instead of light. Others found that they could no longer bear the touch of cold iron, that steel weapons would burn their skin like red-hot brands. A few developed the ability to see through flame, to witness events happening in distant places by staring into candle fire or torch flames. But approximately 1 in every 4 children who underwent the ritual did not survive it. They were found on the morning of the 4th day, lying peacefully beside the dragon egg, as if they had simply fallen asleep. Their bodies showed no signs of violence or distress. They had simply been judged unworthy by whatever force dwelt within the unhatched dragon, and that force had gently stopped their hearts. The families of old Valyria had accepted these losses as necessary. The power to command dragons was not something that could be given freely. It had to be earned through a willingness to sacrifice everything, including one's own life, for the chance to touch the cosmic forces that shaped reality. But the Targaryens who survived the fall of Valyria had lost much of this ancient knowledge. They knew that dragon bonding was dangerous, but they had forgotten the precise rituals that made it safe. When they tried to recreate the ceremonies on Dragonstone, using what fragmentary texts they had managed to save, the results were catastrophic. Prince Aegon the Uncrowned's failed bonding was not an isolated incident. Over the decades that followed, dozens of Targaryen children attempted to claim dragons, and nearly half of them died in the process. The family began to understand that they were missing something crucial, some element of the old knowledge that would allow them to safely determine who could ride and who could not. The answer came from an unexpected source. On the highest peak of Dragonstone, in a crater that had been formed by volcanic activity centuries before the Targaryens arrived, lived a dragon that belonged to no rider. The small folk called it the cannibal, for its habit of devouring the corpses of other dragons. But the cannibal was not a wild dragon, as the histories claim. It was something far older and more significant. According to the Chronicle, the cannibal was one of the original Valyrian dragons, a creature that had been present at the very first dragon bonding ceremonies in the ancient freehold. It had served not as a mount for any dragon lord, but as a judge, a living test that could determine which souls contained the proper resonance for dragon riding. The cannibal's black scales and green flame were not random mutations. They were marks of its unique purpose. The black scales absorbed magical energy, allowing it to sense the deeper currents that flowed through the blood of potential dragon riders. The green flame was not destructive, like the fire of other dragons. It was revealing, capable of showing the true nature of anyone it touched. When a young Targaryen was brought before the cannibal, the ancient dragon would breathe its green flame over them. Those who possessed the dragon seed would emerge unharmed, their skin unmarked by the fire. But those who lacked the proper resonance would be consumed instantly, reduced to ash, so fine that it scattered on the wind. It was a brutal test, but it was also perfectly accurate. In all the centuries that the cannibal had served as judge, it had never been wrong about a candidate's worthiness. King Jaehaerys I was the ruler who finally rediscovered this ancient truth. After losing 2 of his younger brothers to failed dragon bonding attempts, he ordered a search of the deepest archives of Dragonstone. What he found there changed everything the Targaryens thought they knew about their own nature. The dragon seed was not simply a matter of bloodline. It was a spiritual condition, a state of being that could only be achieved through a specific combination of suffering, courage, and magical exposure. Some Targaryens were born with it, having inherited not just royal blood, but the memories of their ancestors' trials. Others could develop it through experiences that brought them to the very edge of death and back again. But most importantly, the dragon seed could be awakened artificially through rituals that deliberately exposed the candidate to the raw forces of fire and blood magic. These rituals were dangerous beyond measure, but they offered a path for those who had not been born with the gift to earn it through their own sacrifice. Jaehaerys ordered the reconstruction of the ancient chamber of binding, this time using the complete text that had been discovered in the archives. But he also instituted a new tradition. Every Targaryen child upon reaching their 16th birthday would be brought to face the cannibal. Those who survived its green flame would be welcomed as true dragons. Those who did not would be honored as martyrs who had given their lives in service to the family's greater purpose. The ceremony became known as the Trial of Flames, and it served not just to identify potential dragon riders, but to remind each generation of Targaryens of the true cost of their power. The ability to command dragons was not a birthright, it was a burden, one that required constant sacrifice to maintain. As the years passed, the Trial of Flames revealed patterns that no one had expected. The dragon seed was more common in times of great strife, when the magical currents that flowed through the world were disturbed by war or catastrophe. Children born during times of peace were far less likely to survive the cannibal's test. This discovery led to a terrible understanding. The Targaryens were not meant to rule during times of peace and prosperity. They were meant to be guardians during times of crisis, when ordinary rulers would be inadequate to face the challenges that threatened the world. The madness that plagued so many Targaryen kings and queens was not a flaw in their bloodline. It was a side effect of carrying the dragon seed, of having souls that were constantly exposed to cosmic forces that mortal minds were not meant to comprehend. The visions, the paranoia, the sudden rages, and equally sudden moments of brilliant clarity, all of these were symptoms of a consciousness that existed partially outside normal reality. But this madness served a purpose. The mad Targaryens were the ones who could see threats that others missed, who could understand the deeper patterns that connected seemingly random events. They were prophets and seers, driven to extremes by the weight of knowledge that they could never fully share. King Aerys II, whom history remembers as the Mad King, was perhaps the most gifted seer ever born to House Targaryen. His wildfire plot was not the product of insanity, but of a vision that showed him King's Landing overrun by ice and shadow. He had seen the army of the dead pouring through the gates of the capital, and he believed that only fire could cleanse the city before it became a stronghold for the enemy. His madness was the madness of a man trying to save a world that could not understand the nature of the threat it faced. The chronicle records that in the final years before Robert's rebellion, Aerys began to have dreams that perfectly matched those experienced by Daenys the Dreamer centuries before. He saw the return of the Long Night, the awakening of ancient evils, and the role that his bloodline would play in the final battle between ice and fire. But he also saw something that Daenys had not foreseen. He saw that the dragons would return, not through careful breeding and magical ritual, but through death and blood sacrifice, on a scale that would make the doom of Valyria seem like a gentle rain. In his final prophetic vision, Aerys saw a young woman with silver hair standing in a burning pyre, calling to dragons that had been dead for more than a century. He saw 3 eggs crack open in the flames, and 3 creatures emerge that would reshape the fate of the world. And he understood that his own death, terrible as it would be, was a necessary part of the pattern that would lead to that moment of rebirth. The dragon seed was not just about the ability to ride dragons. It was about the willingness to sacrifice everything, including sanity, including life itself, for the chance to serve the greater purpose that bound the Targaryen bloodline to the cosmic forces that shaped reality. As the flames of rebellion began to spread across the 7 kingdoms, the last king to sit the Iron Throne whispered a final prophecy to the wildfire that surrounded him. 3 heads of the dragon would rise from the ashes of his failure, and in their rising, the world would either be saved or consumed entirely. The choice, as always, would depend on whether the dragon seed burned bright enough to kindle the fires that would drive back the endless night. For 3 centuries, the maesters of the Citadel had carefully documented what they believed to be an obvious truth about House Targaryen. The dragon kings, they wrote, were cursed with madness that ran in their bloodline like a poison, growing stronger with each generation of inbreeding between siblings. Their scholarly consensus was clear. The Targaryens bred dragons and madness in equal measure, and both were symptoms of their refusal to marry outside their own family. This explanation satisfied the lords of Westeros, who had always been uncomfortable with the alien customs of their Valyrian rulers. It provided a convenient justification for rebellions and usurpations. After all, who could be expected to serve a mad king? The madness was proof that the dragons were unfit to rule, that their reign was contrary to the natural order of things. But in the hidden archives of Dragonstone, older texts told a very different story. The madness of the Targaryens was not random insanity brought on by flawed breeding. It was a specific condition that followed patterns so precise they could be predicted generations in advance. Grand Maester Muncan, writing in secret after the Dance of Dragons, had been the first to notice these patterns. He observed that Targaryen madness was not evenly distributed throughout the family line. It appeared most commonly in times of great upheaval, when the magical currents that flowed through the world were disturbed by war, death, or the awakening of ancient powers. Moreover, the madness was not truly madness at all. It was prophetic vision so intense and overwhelming that those who experienced it could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was yet to come, between the present moment and the cosmic forces that shaped the future. The first clear example of this pattern was King Baelor the Blessed, who was dismissed by later historians as a religious fanatic whose piety had driven him to insanity. But Baelor's visions, when examined carefully, proved to be remarkably accurate predictions of events that would unfold decades after his death. Baelor had foreseen the Blackfire rebellions, describing in his journals a false dragon rising in the east, bearing a sword of black flame. He had predicted the Great Spring Sickness, writing of a pale mare that would ride from Tyros to the Wall, leaving only graves in her wake. Most significantly, he had prophesied the War of the Nine Penny Kings, describing it as the first thunder before the storm that would break the world. But Baelor's most important vision concerned his own bloodline. In the final year of his reign, he began to speak of the prince that was promised, a figure who would be born of ice and fire, and would unite the realm against the darkness that comes with winter. He saw this prince clearly in his visions, describing details that would prove accurate centuries later. A bastard raised in the north, marked by both wolf and dragon, whose parentage would be hidden until the moment of greatest need. The maesters dismissed these prophecies as the ravings of a dying fanatic, but every word proved true. King Arion Brightflame, whom history remembers as the prince who drank wildfire, believing it would transform him into a dragon, had actually been experiencing visions of the dragon's return. In the months before his death, he had written obsessively about 3 eggs that would hatch in fire and blood, about a silver-haired queen who would emerge from flames unburned, about the moment when the magic that had been sleeping for a century would wake once more. His death was not suicide driven by madness. It was a ritual sacrifice, an attempt to kindle the magical fires that would one day allow dragons to return to the world. The wildfire he drank was not meant to transform his body. It was meant to transform his soul, to send his spirit forward through time, to the moment when it would be needed to guide the hatching of the 3 dragons that would save the world. Prince Duncan the Small, who gave up his crown for love and died in the flames at Summerhall, had spent his final months in a trance-like state, speaking constantly of the prince that would come from ashes. His abdication was not romantic folly. It was a deliberate act designed to ensure that the Targaryen succession would flow through the bloodline most likely to produce the prophesied savior. Duncan had seen that his own children would not carry the dragon seed necessary for the trials to come, but he had also seen that his brother Jaehaerys would father a line that carried within it the potential for greatness and tragedy in equal measure. By giving up the throne, Duncan ensured that prophecy would unfold as it was meant to. Even King Aerys II, The Mad King, whose paranoia and cruelty sparked Robert's rebellion, was not truly insane. He was a man overwhelmed by visions of the future, so terrible that they shattered his ability to exist in the present moment. Aerys had seen the long night returning. He had witnessed the army of the dead marching south, led by creatures of ice and shadow that could raise the fallen to serve their cause. He had watched in his dreams as King's Landing fell to these monsters, as the population of the capital was transformed into mindless servants of an ancient evil. His obsession with wildfire was not born from madness, but from a desperate attempt to prevent this future. He had seen that fire was the only weapon that could truly destroy the enemy that was coming. His plan to burn King's Landing was not meant to be an act of spite against his rebellious subjects. It was meant to be a preemptive strike against an enemy that most people could not even imagine. The whispers he heard were not delusions. They were the voices of his ancestors, the spirits of previous Targaryen kings and queens who had seen fragments of the same terrible future and were trying to guide him toward the actions that would prevent it. When Aerys muttered about enemies hiding in every shadow, he was not paranoid. He was seeing the servants of the Night King, creatures that could wear human faces but served a power that wanted nothing less than the extinction of all life. His trust in no one but his family was not born from madness, but from the knowledge that anyone could be compromised by an enemy that could resurrect the dead. But perhaps the most misunderstood of all the so-called Mad Targaryens was Prince Rhaegar, heir to the Iron Throne and father of the prince that was promised. History remembers him as a man who abandoned his wife and children for love of Lyanna Stark, whose selfish actions sparked the war that ended Targaryen rule. The truth was far more complex and tragic. Rhaegar had inherited the strongest gift of prophetic vision in the Targaryen bloodline since Daenerys the Dreamer. From childhood he had been tormented by dreams of ice and shadow, of a darkness that would consume the world unless specific actions were taken to prevent it. He saw the pattern that connected all of Targaryen history, understood that every king and queen of his line had been playing a role in a cosmic drama that would culminate in his own generation. Most importantly, he had seen that the prince that was promised would be born from his union with a woman of Stark blood. Not from love, though love would grow between them, but from the ancient pact that Aegon the Conqueror had made with Torrhen Stark beneath the heart tree of Winterfell. Rhaegar's prophecies showed him that his son by Elia of Dorne, though beloved, was not the prince of prophecy. That child carried fire, but not ice, dragon blood, but not the wolf's strength that would be needed for the battles to come. The true prince that was promised would need both bloodlines, both the fire of old Valyria and the ice of the first men. This knowledge tormented Rhaegar for years. He loved his wife and children, had no desire to abandon them or bring war to the realm. But his visions showed him a future where the failure to produce the prophesied prince would result in the extinction of all human life. The personal cost, terrible as it was, could not be weighed against the survival of the world itself. When he finally acted on his visions, taking Lyanna Stark to the Tower of Joy, he did so knowing that he was sacrificing his own happiness, his reputation, perhaps his very life, for a chance to fulfill prophecy. He understood that he would be remembered as a villain, that songs would be written about his cruelty and selfishness. But he also knew that if his sacrifice succeeded, if the prince that was promised was born from his union with the wolf girl, then the songs would not matter. The world would survive, and that was the only thing that truly counted. The final proof that Targaryen madness was actually a prophetic gift came from an unexpected source. Bran the Broken, the three-eyed raven who would one day sit the Iron Throne, possessed the ability to see through the eyes of the heart trees, to witness events from across the centuries. Through his visions, Bran confirmed what the Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy had always claimed. Every mad Targaryen had been seeing true visions of the future. Their madness was not insanity but clarity, a perception so acute that it allowed them to see beyond the limitations of linear time. The tragedy was that their visions were so far ahead of their time, so removed from the immediate concerns of their subjects, that no one could understand what they were trying to prevent. They were prophets speaking to a world that was not ready to hear their warnings. The Tailor the Blessed had seen the return of magic to the world. Targaryen Brightflame had witnessed the birth of the last dragons. Duncan the Small had foreseen the importance of love in the final battle against the darkness. Ares II had glimpsed the army of the dead, and Rhaegar had understood that sacrifice, not conquest, would be the key to humanity's salvation. Each of them had played their part in a pattern too vast for any single mortal mind to comprehend fully. Their apparent madness was actually wisdom, a deep understanding of cosmic forces that most people could never even imagine. And as the wheel of history continued to turn, as the events they had foreseen began to unfold exactly as they had predicted, it became clear that the Targaryens had never been cursed with madness. They had been blessed with the terrible gift of prophecy, and they had borne that burden with courage that history would never properly acknowledge. The false conclusion that their condition was madness had served its purpose, allowing them to act on their visions without revealing the true scope of the threat that humanity faced. But now, as the long night approached and the pieces of the great pattern began to fall into place, the truth could finally be revealed. The Dragon Kings had not been mad. They had been the sanest people in a world that was going insane, the only ones who could see clearly enough to prepare for the darkness that was coming. And their preparations, costly as they had been, would soon prove to be the difference between salvation and extinction. The Dance of Dragons has been remembered by history as the most devastating civil war in Westerosi history, a conflict that nearly destroyed House Targaryen and led to the extinction of dragons themselves. The Maesters wrote of it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of disputed succession, a bloody reminder of what happens when brother fights brother for a crown. But the Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy tells a different story entirely. The dance was not a civil war born from ambition or sibling rivalry. It was a test, orchestrated by forces beyond mortal understanding, to determine which branch of the Targaryen bloodline would be strong enough to face the darkness that was coming. The truth began to emerge in the reign of King Viserys I, decades before the first blood was shed in the war. Viserys had been experiencing prophetic dreams since childhood, visions that showed him two possible futures for his house and for the world itself. In one future he saw House Targaryen united under a single ruler, their dragons multiplying until the skies were filled with fire and wings. This seemed like the future any king would want for his dynasty. But the vision also showed him that this united house would grow complacent in its power, that the dragons would become mere symbols of authority rather than weapons against the ancient enemy. In the second future, Viserys saw his house torn apart by civil war, dragons fighting dragons until the creatures themselves were nearly extinct. This future seemed like a nightmare, a catastrophe that any responsible king would do everything in his power to prevent. But the vision also revealed that from this devastation would emerge a bloodline purified by suffering, dragons reborn through sacrifice, and a family finally prepared for its true purpose. The prophecy was clear. The Dance of Dragons was not a disaster to be avoided. It was a necessary trial that would test the Targaryen bloodline and prepare it for the greater war to come. But Viserys was not meant to choose which future would unfold. That choice belonged to the dragons themselves. The first sign that the dragons were aware of their role in the coming test appeared during the reign of King Jaehaerys and Queen Alysanne. Their dragon Vermithor and Silverwing began to exhibit behavior that no dragon keeper had ever witnessed before. The great beasts would fly to the highest peaks of Dragonstone and remain there for days at a time, their necks stretched toward the sky, as if they were listening to something that human ears could not detect. When they returned from these vigils, both dragons showed physical changes. Their flames burned hotter, their scales seemed to shimmer with inner light, and their eyes held an intelligence that went far beyond animal cunning. They had been touched by the same cosmic forces that granted prophetic dreams to their riders, and they had accepted a burden that would shape the fate of their entire species. The dragons were preparing for the trial that would determine which of their kind would survive to fight in the final battle against ice and shadow. Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen was chosen as heir to the Iron Throne, not because of her father's love or her political acumen, but because her dragon, Syrax, had been marked by prophecy. In the ancient texts of Old Valyria, there were references to golden dragons whose flames would kindle the fires that would light the world during its darkest hour. Syrax was such a dragon. Her golden scales were not merely beautiful, they were magical, capable of storing and channeling the power of dragonfire in ways that other dragons could not match. When Rhaenyra rode her, the princess experienced visions that showed her glimpses of the future that awaited her bloodline. She saw a silver-haired queen rising from flames unburned, 3 dragons hatching from eggs that had been thought dead, and a battle that would determine whether the sun would rise again or whether eternal winter would claim the world. Most importantly, she saw that this future queen would carry her blood, that the line of succession must pass through her if prophecy was to be fulfilled. But Prince Aegon II, Rhaenyra's half-brother, had also been marked by the dragons. His mount, Sunfire, was said to be the most beautiful dragon that had ever lived, with scales that gleamed like beaten gold and flames that burned so purely they seemed almost white. Sunfire's beauty was not vanity, it was power. The dragon's perfect proportions and flawless coloring were signs that he carried within his blood the original template from which all other dragons had been created. He was a link to the very first dragons of Old Valyria, the creatures that had been present when the Dragon Lords first learned to bind fire and wing to their will. Aegon's visions, granted to him through his bond with Sunfire, showed him a different aspect of the future. He saw the importance of strength and purity in the coming battles, the need for dragons whose fire burned hot enough to melt the ice that would threaten the world. His line, he believed, would produce the warriors who would stand against the darkness when lesser men faltered. Both Rhaenyra and Aegon were right. Both of their bloodlines would be necessary for the prophecies to unfold as they were meant to. But the cosmic forces that shaped reality demanded that only one line could claim the Iron Throne. The other would need to find a different path to fulfill its destiny. The test that would determine which path each bloodline would take came in the form of Queen Alicent Hightower, Aegon's mother. History remembers her as an ambitious woman who manipulated her husband and poisoned her stepchildren's minds against their half-sister. But Alicent carried a secret that she had hidden even from herself. Deep in the bloodline of House Hightower, buried beneath centuries of marriages to other noble families, flowed a trace of Valyrian blood. Alicent's ancestor, centuries before the conquest, had been a Targaryen bastard who had fled Dragonstone during one of the family's periodic purges and had taken refuge with the Lords of the Reach. This hidden heritage manifested itself in Alicent through dreams that she dismissed as mere nightmares. She saw towers of ice stretching toward a black sky, armies of the dead marching beneath banners of winter, and a darkness that devoured light itself. But she also saw that her son Aegon would father a line that would stand against this darkness, that his descendants would be among the 3 heads of the dragon that would save the world. The conflict between Alicent and Rhaenyra was not personal ambition. It was the collision of 2 prophetic bloodlines, each driven by visions that showed them different aspects of the same ultimate truth. When King Viserys died and the question of succession erupted into open warfare, the dragons themselves began to choose sides in ways that defied their riders' expectations. Some dragons, like Caraxes and Melis, were drawn to Rhaenyra's cause by the golden fire that surrounded her destiny. Others, like Vhagar and Targaryen, were compelled to support Aegon by the pure flames that marked his bloodline's role in the coming war. But most surprisingly, some dragons refused to fight at all. Vermithor, the great bronze dragon that had once carried King Jaehaerys, withdrew to the highest peaks of Dragonstone and would not descend no matter how his potential riders called to him. Silverwing, Queen Alysanne's mount, flew across the narrow sea and was not seen again for months. These dragons had seen further into the future than their riders could perceive. They understood that the dance was not the real war, merely a prelude to conflicts that would dwarf anything that mortals had yet imagined. They were conserving their strength for battles that would determine the fate of all life itself. The turning point of the dance came at the battle above the God's Eye, when Prince Aemon Targaryen on Vhagar faced Prince Daemon Targaryen on Caraxes. The two dragons and their riders killed each other in a battle so fierce that it turned the waters of the Great Lake to steam and left scars in the lakebed that would remain visible for centuries. But this was not a meaningless waste of life. As the histories suggest, it was a sacrifice that served a purpose beyond the understanding of those who witnessed it. When Vhagar and Caraxes died, their spirits were not extinguished. Instead, they merged with the magical currents that flowed through the world, becoming part of the cosmic forces that would one day kindle the fires needed to hatch the last dragons. Their deaths were not an ending, but a transformation, a willing sacrifice that would make possible the rebirth of their species when the world needed them most. Daemon Targaryen's final act was not madness or desperation. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy that he had carried in his dreams since childhood. He had seen that his death would be necessary to create the conditions for the return of dragons, that his sacrifice would echo through the centuries and make possible the birth of the three creatures that would save the world. Prince Aemon's decision to pursue Daemon over the God's Eye was not driven by rage or vengeance. It was compelled by the same prophetic forces that had guided his ancestor Aegon the Conqueror. He understood that his own death would serve the greater purpose, that the merging of his dragon spirit with Caraxes would create a reservoir of power that could be tapped by future generations. As the dance continued to devastate both sides, other dragons began to make their own sacrifices. Seasmoke and Targaryen killed each other at Tumbleton, their deaths adding to the growing pool of draconic power that was accumulating in the magical realm. Syrax died defending King's Landing, her golden flames becoming part of the fire that would one day allow her bloodline's dragons to hatch. By the end of the war, nearly all the dragons were dead, and House Targaryen was reduced to a handful of survivors clinging to power through political maneuvering rather than draconic might. The realm mourned the loss of the great creatures that had made the conquest possible, and many believed that magic itself had died with them. But the chronicle reveals that the dragons had not died at all. They had simply changed form, their physical bodies sacrificed so that their spirits could join the cosmic forces that shaped reality. They had become part of the magical matrix that would one day allow 3 eggs to crack open in a funeral pyre, and 3 new dragons to emerge, creatures that would carry within their flames the accumulated power of all their predecessors. The Dance of Dragons was not the end of the Dragon Age. It was the beginning of their transformation from creatures of conquest to guardians of the world itself. Princess Rhaenyra's death, burned alive by her half-brother's dragon, was not a defeat but an apotheosis. Her spirit joined those of her predecessors in the realm beyond death, where she would wait to guide her descendant when the time came for the dragons to return. Her final words, spoken as Sunfire's flames consumed her, were not a curse but a prophecy. The dragons will remember. They will come back, and when they do, the world will burn, but it will not be consumed. King Aegon II's victory was hollow, for he understood too late that winning the throne had never been the point. The real purpose of the dance had been to prepare both bloodlines for their true destiny, to purify them through suffering and loss until they were ready to fulfill the prophecies that had been written in fire and blood. When Aegon died, Poisoned by his own supporters who had grown tired of war, his final vision showed him the truth that had been hidden throughout the conflict. He saw Daenerys Targaryen standing in a burning pyre, calling to dragons that carried within their hearts the spirits of Sunfire and Syrax, of Vigar and Caraxes, of all the dragons that had died in the dance. He understood then that victory and defeat were meaningless concepts when measured against the cosmic forces that shaped reality. Both he and Rhaenyra had played their parts in a drama too vast for mortal minds to fully comprehend. The dragons had danced, and in their dancing they had prepared the way for their own resurrection and for the battles that would determine whether light or darkness would ultimately triumph. The test was complete. The bloodlines were purified, and in the magical realm where spirits dwelt beyond death, the dragons waited patiently for the moment when they would rise again to fulfill their true purpose as guardians of the world. In the years following the Dance of Dragons, as House Targaryen struggled to rebuild from the ashes of civil war, a new bloodline began to emerge that would challenge everything the realm thought it knew about legitimacy, succession, and the true nature of royal power. Daemon Blackfyre was born a bastard, but he carried within his veins something that even true-born princes lacked. When King Aegon IV legitimized all his bastard children on his deathbed, he was not simply trying to create chaos for his successor. He was responding to prophetic visions that had tormented him throughout his reign, visions that showed him the true purpose behind the proliferation of Targaryen bastards throughout the realm. The Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy records that Aegon IV experienced the most vivid prophetic dreams of any Targaryen since Daenerys herself. But unlike his ancestors, whose visions showed them distant futures, Aegon's dreams revealed the hidden connections that linked every Targaryen bloodline across the centuries. He saw that the Dance of Dragons had not simply killed dragons and devastated the royal family. It had also scattered Targaryen blood throughout Westeros in ways that previous generations had never imagined. Bastards and cadet branches, forgotten cousins and distant relatives, all carrying fragments of the dragon seed that would one day be needed to fulfill the ancient prophecies. Most importantly, he saw that the 3 heads of the dragon prophesied to save the world would not all come from the main line of House Targaryen. One would be born from the legitimate succession, carrying the weight of the Iron Throne and the responsibility of uniting the realm. Another would emerge from the bastard lines, marked by exile and struggle, but strengthened by adversity. The third would come from a bloodline that had been thought extinct, returning from across the narrow sea with dragons, reborn from death itself. Daemon Blackfyre represented the second head of the dragon, the bastard prince whose strength would be forged in the fires of rebellion and loss. But Daemon's claim to legitimacy went far deeper than his father's deathbed decree. The Chronicle reveals secrets about House Targaryen's marriage customs that had been hidden for centuries, practices that dated back to the earliest days of Old Valyria and had been maintained in secret even after the conquest of Westeros. In the ancient freehold, the Dragonlord families had practiced a form of marriage that was more complex than the simple monogamy or polygamy that outsiders observed. They recognized what they called soul bonds, connections between individuals that transcended legal ceremony and were based on the magical resonance that flowed between compatible spirits. These bonds were not chosen by the individuals involved. They were detected by dragons, whose sensitivity to magical currents allowed them to perceive when 2 souls carried complementary aspects of the dragon seed. When such a bond was identified, it was considered more sacred than any marriage ceremony, more binding than any legal contract. The Chronicle records that King Aegon IV had experienced such a soul bond with Daenerys the Defiant, one of the daughters of the previous king, who had been confined to the Maiden Vault to prevent them from marrying and potentially complicating the succession. The attraction between Aegon and Daenerys was not mere lust or romantic fancy. It was a recognition on the deepest level of their beings that their union would produce a child carrying a crucial aspect of the dragon seed. When Daemon Blackfire was born from this union, he possessed something that had been absent from the Targaryen bloodline since the Dance of Dragons. His dragon seed was not diluted by generations of peaceful rule and comfortable living. It was raw, primal, connected directly to the cosmic forces that had shaped the first dragons in the volcanic forges of Old Valyria. This power manifested itself in ways that no one fully understood at the time. Daemon could handle Valyrian steel without gloves, his bare hands seeming to draw strength from the metal rather than being cut by its supernatural sharpness. He could stare into flames for hours without blinking, his eyes reflecting the fire like polished amethysts. Most remarkably, he could sense the presence of dragons, even though no living dragons remained in Westeros. Daemon's connection to draconic power was so strong that when he wielded Blackfire, the sword that had belonged to Aegon the Conqueror, the blade seemed to burn with inner fire. Those who fought against him reported that his weapon cut through their armor as if it were cloth, that sparks flew from every strike, and that the air around him shimmered with heat even in the depths of winter. But the true significance of Daemon's rebellion was not his personal power or his claim to the throne. It was the role he was destined to play in preserving and strengthening the Targaryen bloodline for the trials that lay ahead. The rebellion that erupted around Daemon's claim divided the realm along lines that seemed political but were actually magical. Those who supported Daemon were drawn to him by the raw draconic power that he embodied, the promise of a return to the days when Targaryens were more than mere kings and queens. Those who remained loyal to Daryon II were responding to a different aspect of the dragon seed, the careful cultivation of prophetic wisdom that would be needed to guide the realm through the dark times ahead. The war that followed was not simply a contest between bastard and trueborn. It was a test to determine which aspects of Targaryen power would survive and which would be sacrificed for the greater good. Bloodraven, Daemon's half-brother and greatest enemy, possessed gifts that made him perhaps the most dangerous man in Westeros. His ability to see through the eyes of ravens and his mastery of what the small folk called dark magic were not separate talents but different aspects of the same cosmic awareness that had driven previous Targaryen kings to apparent madness. Bloodraven could perceive the threads of fate that connected all living things, could see how individual choices rippled outward through time to create consequences that would not become apparent for generations. His hatred of Daemon was not personal ambition or sibling rivalry. It was the response of a man who could see that Daemon's victory would lead to catastrophic changes in the pattern of destiny. Through his prophetic sight, Bloodraven had witnessed the return of the others, the awakening of the Night King, and the role that the Targaryen bloodline would need to play in the final battle between ice and fire. He understood that Daemon's raw power, magnificent as it was not sufficient for the trials ahead. The realm would need rulers who combined strength with wisdom, who could unite the Seven Kingdoms, not through conquest but through the deeper bonds of shared purpose. The Battle of the Red Grass Field, where Daemon Blackfire met his death, was the culmination of forces that had been building since the Dance of Dragons. But it was not simply a military engagement, it was a magical duel between two different visions of what House Targaryen needed to become. When Bloodraven's arrow pierced Daemon's throat, it was not luck or superior archery skill that guided the shot. It was the same prophetic power that had allowed Daedalus the Dreamer to foresee the doom of Valyria. Bloodraven had seen this moment in his visions for years, had known exactly when and where and how Daemon would fall. But Daemon's death was not a defeat, it was a transformation. The chronicle reveals that when Daemon died, his spirit did not pass into whatever afterlife awaited ordinary mortals. Instead, like the dragons who had perished in the dance, his essence merged with the magical currents that flowed through the world. His raw draconic power became part of the cosmic forces that would one day enable the hatching of the 3 dragons that would save the world. More importantly, his bloodline did not die with him. His sons Aegon and Aemon Blackfire carried within their veins the same potent combination of dragon seed and exile that would prove crucial in the generations to come. Their descendants would eventually make their way across the narrow sea, where they would play roles in the preservation and eventual resurrection of the Targaryen dynasty. The Golden Company, formed by Daemon's supporters after his death, was not simply a mercenary company seeking gold and glory in the free cities. It was a repository of Targaryen blood, a hidden branch of the royal family that would maintain its strength and purpose through decades of exile. The company's motto, "Beneath the gold, the bitter steel," referred not just to their military prowess but to their true nature. Beneath the facade of sellswords and exiles lay bitter determination, the steel of Valyrian blood that would not be broken by defeat or diminished by time. Bloodraven's victory at Redgrass Field established him as the power behind the Iron Throne for decades to come. But his true significance lay not in his political influence, but in his role as the bridge between the Age of Dragons and the Age of Ice and Fire that was approaching. His transformation from royal bastard to the three-eyed raven was not an abandonment of his Targaryen heritage, but its ultimate fulfillment. By merging his consciousness with the ancient network of weirwood trees, he became something that no previous member of his house had achieved, a guardian who could watch over the realm from beyond the constraints of mortal life. Through the eyes of ravens and the memories of trees, Bloodraven would monitor the bloodlines that carried the dragon seed, guiding them through the trials and tribulations that would prepare them for their final purpose. He would watch over the last Targaryens in exile, ensuring that they survived long enough to return with dragons when the world needed them most. The Blackfire rebellions that continued to plague the realm for generations were not simply about legitimacy or succession. Each rebellion was a test, designed to strengthen the surviving Targaryen bloodlines and ensure that only the strongest would survive to face the darkness that was coming. Meleys the Monstrous, the last of the Blackfire pretenders, was not defeated by chance when he fell at the War of the Ninepenny Kings. His death marked the completion of a process that had begun with Daemon's rebellion decades earlier. The bastard line had served its purpose, had contributed its strength to the magical forces that would reshape the world, and now its role was finished. But the blood lived on, scattered throughout Essos in forms that most observers would never recognize. In the veins of merchants and sellswords, of priests and slaves, the dragon seed waited patiently for the moment when it would be called upon once more. The Chronicle's final entry on the Blackfire rebellions contains a prophecy that Bloodraven whispered to the heart trees before his final transformation. He had seen that the bastard line would have one final role to play, that in the last days of the Targaryen dynasty, when dragons returned to the world and the long night threatened all life, the scattered descendants of Daemon Blackfire would emerge from hiding to stand with their legitimate cousins in the battle for the dawn. The bitter steel beneath the gold would be revealed at last, and the realm would understand that there had never been true bastards in the dragon's blood, only different paths to the same glorious and terrible destiny. The rebellion was over, but its consequences would echo through the centuries, shaping the fate of the world in ways that even Bloodraven's far-seeing eyes could not fully comprehend. The Palace of Summerhall stood as a monument to Targaryen dreams and ambitions, a place where King Aegon V had hoped to recapture the glory of his ancestors by bringing dragons back to the world. But on a night that should have been filled with celebration, when a new prince was born to carry on the royal line, the palace became a funeral pyre that would reshape the destiny of House Targaryen forever. The official histories speak of the tragedy as an accident, a fire that spread too quickly through the wooden halls and claimed the lives of many nobles, including King Aegon himself. But the Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy reveals that what happened at Summerhall was no accident. It was a ritual sacrifice on a scale that had not been seen since the doom of Valyria, a deliberate act designed to kindle the magical fires that would make possible the return of dragons to the world. King Aegon V had been haunted by prophetic dreams since his youth, visions that showed him the approaching long night and the role that dragons would need to play in humanity's survival. Unlike his predecessors, who had accepted the extinction of dragons as an irreversible tragedy, Aegon believed that the great creatures could be brought back through a combination of ancient knowledge and desperate courage. His obsession with dragon eggs was not the foolish fancy of a king trying to recapture past glories. It was the response of a man who had seen in his dreams the 3 dragons that would be hatched by his descendant, and who understood that certain conditions would need to be met before that hatching could occur. The eggs that Aegon had collected over the years were not ordinary dragon eggs. They were the last remnants of clutches laid by the greatest dragons of the past, creatures whose spirits had been waiting in the magical realm for the proper moment to return to the world of the living. Each egg contained not just the potential for new life, but the accumulated wisdom and power of dragons that had served House Targaryen for centuries. But the chronicle reveals that these eggs could not be hatched through ordinary means. The fires of Dragonstone, hot as they were, lacked the magical intensity needed to wake spirits that had been sleeping for more than a century. What was required was a fire fed not by wood or oil, but by the willing sacrifice of those who carried the dragon seed in their blood. Prince Duncan the Small, who had given up his crown for love, and now served his brother as a simple lord, had been experiencing visions that paralleled those of his king. But Duncan's dreams showed him something that Aegon had not yet understood. The hatching of dragons would require not just magical fire, but the merger of ice and fire, the union of Targaryen blood with the ancient power of the first men. The woman Duncan had married, Jenny of Oldstones, was not the simple commoner that the histories describe. She was the last descendant of the Fisher Kings who had ruled the Riverlands before the coming of the Andals, carrying in her veins a trace of the same magic that flowed through the heart trees and the children of the forest. Jenny's friend, the ghost of High Heart, was no mere woods witch dispensing cryptic prophecies for coin. She was one of the last of the children of the forest, a being whose connection to the magical currents of the world allowed her to see across the barriers of time and death. Her presence at Summerhall was not coincidence but destiny, for her role in the coming ritual would be as crucial as that of any Targaryen. The ghost had seen in her dreams the exact moment when the conditions would be right for the dragon hatching ritual. It would come when a prince was born under a bleeding star, when the magical currents disturbed by conflict and change created the proper resonance for the awakening of sleeping spirits. That prince was Rhaegar Targaryen, born in the flames of Summerhall as the palace burned around him. The ritual began at sunset, when King Aegon gathered his family and closest companions in the great hall of Summerhall. The dragon eggs, 7 in total, were placed on a table made from the heartwood of a weirwood tree that had been cut down centuries earlier when the palace was built. Around each egg were arranged artifacts that had belonged to the dragons of old: scales from Balerion the Black Dread, a tooth from Vhagar, claws from Caraxes and Syrax. The ghost of High Heart began to sing in the old tongue, words that spoke of the time before the coming of men, when dragons and the children of the forest had shared the world in harmony. Her song was not meant for human ears, but for the spirits that dwelt within the eggs, calling them back from the realm of death to the world of the living. As the sun set and the first stars appeared, King Aegon began the second part of the ritual. He took a dagger made of Valyrian steel and cut his palm, letting his blood drip onto each of the 7 eggs. The blood of other Targaryens present followed Prince Duncan, Lord Lionel Baratheon, who had married into the royal family, Sir Dunk the Tall, whose loyalty had earned him a place among the king's most trusted companions. But mortal blood alone was not sufficient to wake dragons that had been sleeping for generations. What was needed was the willing sacrifice of those whose dragon seed burned brightest, whose spirits could merge with the magical forces that would give new life to the ancient creatures. Prince Duncan understood his role in the ritual before anyone else. He had seen in his dreams that his death would create the spark needed to ignite the dragon fire, that his sacrifice would open the pathway between the world of the living and the realm where dragon spirits waited. When he walked into the flames that were beginning to spread through the great hall, he was not fleeing in panic or overcome by smoke. He was fulfilling the destiny that he had accepted when he gave up his crown, offering his life so that dragons might return to serve his nephew in the battles that lay ahead. King Aegon's death followed moments later, not from the flames but from the overwhelming surge of magical energy that his ritual had unleashed. His heart, already weakened by years of carrying the burden of prophetic visions, could not withstand the cosmic forces that were reshaping reality around him. But his sacrifice was not in vain. As the king died, his spirit merged with the magical currents that were flowing through the burning palace, adding his strength to the forces that were working to bring the dragon eggs to life. The ghost of High Heart's final act was to gather the 7 eggs as the palace burned around her and carry them to a place of safety where they could continue to incubate in the magical fires that had been kindled by the ritual. She understood that the dragons would not hatch immediately, that the process begun at Summerhall would take decades to complete. But she also knew that when the time was right, when the prophesied queen stood in her own funeral pyre, 3 of these eggs would crack open and release the creatures that would save the world from eternal darkness. The baby born in the flames of Summerhall carried within his blood not just the heritage of House Targaryen, but the accumulated power of all those who had died in the ritual. Rhaegar Targaryen was marked from birth as the prince who would understand the true cost of prophecy, who would be willing to sacrifice everything for the chance to fulfill destiny. The melancholy that would characterize Rhaegar throughout his life was not simply artistic temperament or noble sensitivity. It was the weight of knowledge, the understanding that he carried within his soul the spirits of those who had died to make his birth possible. He could feel their presence in his dreams, their whispered guidance in moments of crucial decision. When Rhaegar sang of ancient heroes and tragic loves, he was not simply entertaining courtiers with beautiful music. He was channeling the memories of those who had passed beyond death, giving voice to stories that needed to be preserved for the trials that lay ahead. The prophecy that would drive Rhaegar to his fateful decision to take Lyanna Stark was planted in his mind during those first moments of life in the burning palace. As he drew his first breath, the spirits of the dead whispered to him of the prince that was promised, of the song of ice and fire that would play out through his own bloodline. The tragedy at Summerhall had achieved its purpose, but at a cost that would echo through the generations. The magical fires kindled by the deaths of so many noble souls had created the conditions necessary for the eventual return of dragons, but they had also set in motion events that would lead to the fall of the Targaryen dynasty. The ritual had been only partially successful. 7 eggs had been prepared for hatching, but only 3 would eventually be brought to life. The other 4 remained dormant, waiting for a second ritual that would provide the additional power needed for their awakening. This second ritual would come decades later, in the funeral pyre of Khal Drogo, when Daenerys Targaryen would unknowingly complete the work that her great-great-grandfather had begun at Summerhall. The 3 eggs that would hatch in that distant fire had been nurtured by the sacrifice of King Aegon and Prince Duncan, their shells cracking at the moment, when the magical conditions were finally perfect for the return of dragons to the world. But the chronicle reveals that the remaining 4 eggs were not lost or destroyed. They were hidden away, waiting for the moment when they too would be needed. For the prophecy spoke not just of 3 dragons, but of 7 creatures that would be needed for battles that lay beyond even the defeat of the Night King. The ghost of High Heart, before she vanished into the woods never to be seen again, left behind a final prophecy about the eggs that had not yet hatched. She spoke of a time when the wheel would be broken and the Game of Thrones would end, when the last Targaryen would face a choice between ruling and saving the world. In that moment of ultimate decision, when the fate of all life hung in the balance, The remaining dragon eggs would hatch not in fire but in ice, bringing forth creatures whose flames burned cold as winter stars, but whose hearts were filled with the warmth of sacrifice and love. The tragedy at Summerhole was the beginning of the end for the age of kings and queens, the first step toward a future where power would be measured not by the number of crowns one could claim, but by the willingness to sacrifice those crowns for the greater good. King Aegon V had succeeded in his desperate gamble, though he would never live to see the fruits of his sacrifice. The magical fires that consumed Summerhole had awakened forces that had been sleeping since the doom of Valyria, had set in motion the chain of events that would culminate in the birth of the last dragons and the return of magic to a world that had forgotten its power. But the cost of this victory would be paid by his descendants, who would carry the burden of prophecy through generations of war, exile, and loss, until the moment came when they could finally fulfill the destiny that had been purchased with so much noble blood. The ashes of Summerhole were scattered by the wind, but the memory of what had been accomplished there would burn forever in the hearts of those who understood the true price of salvation. The war that would come to be known as Robert's Rebellion began, according to the histories, with a simple act of passion. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen allegedly kidnapped Lyanna Stark, the daughter of the Lord of Winterfell, sparking a conflict that would topple a dynasty and reshape the political landscape of Westeros forever. But the chronicle of blood and prophecy reveals a truth far more complex and terrible than mere kidnapping or even forbidden love. What the world witnessed as Robert's Rebellion was actually the final act of a cosmic drama that had been unfolding since the doom of Valyria, a carefully orchestrated sequence of events designed to position the right bloodlines in the right places at the moment when the ancient prophecies would finally be fulfilled. The rebellion was not the result of Rhaegar's impulsive decision to take Lyanna Stark. It was the inevitable consequence of forces that had been building for centuries, guided by visions and prophecies that reached across time to ensure that the prince that was promised would be born when the world needed him most. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen had been tormented by prophetic dreams since his birth in the flames of Summerhole. These visions showed him fragments of a future so terrible that they drove him to actions that seemed incomprehensible to those around him. He saw the long night returning, the dead rising to march against the living, and ice creeping south to extinguish the fires of civilization forever. But most importantly, he saw that the Savior prophesied to stand against this darkness would be born from the union of ice and fire, from the joining of Targaryen blood with the ancient magic of the first men that flowed through the Stark bloodline. The Song of Ice and Fire was not a metaphor or a poetic description of cosmic forces. It was a literal recipe for the creation of a champion whose blood would carry both the fire of dragons and the ice of winter, whose heritage would allow him to command both the magical flames needed to destroy the army of the dead and the primal cold necessary to forge the weapons that could kill their leaders. Lyanna Stark was not chosen by Rhaegar because of her beauty or her spirit, though she possessed both in abundance. She was chosen because her bloodline carried within it a concentration of First Men magic that had not been seen since the Age of Heroes. The blood of the kings of winter flowed in her veins, along with traces of the magic that had built the wall and bound the ancient pacts that kept the others at bay. The Tower of Joy, where Rhaegar brought Lyanna and where their son would be born, was not simply a remote fortress chosen for its isolation. It was built on a site that had been sacred to the First Men for thousands of years, a place where the magical currents of dawn converged with the power that flowed north from the ancient heart of winter. The tower itself was positioned at the exact center of a pattern of standing stones that had been erected by the children of the forest in the dawn age of the world. These stones served as focal points for the magic that would be needed to ensure that the child born in the tower would carry both bloodlines in perfect balance. But the cosmic forces that shaped reality demanded more than just the right bloodlines coming together at the right place and time. They required that the child be born in circumstances that would forge his character for the trials ahead, that would prepare him to make the sacrifices that would be required to save the world. This is why Robert's rebellion was not just allowed to happen, but actively orchestrated by the same prophetic powers that had guided House Targaryen for centuries. The madness of King Aerys II was not simply the result of genetic instability or the stress of ruling a fractious kingdom. It was the manifestation of prophetic visions so intense and overwhelming that they shattered his ability to distinguish between present reality and future possibility. Aerys had seen the army of the dead marching south, had witnessed the Night King raising the fallen to serve his cause, had watched in his dreams as King's Landing was overrun by creatures of ice and shadow. His obsession with wildfire was not born from madness, but from a desperate attempt to prepare for a siege that most people could not even imagine. But the visions also showed him that his death would be necessary to set in motion the events that would eventually lead to the Night King's defeat. His paranoia and cruelty were not random acts of insanity, but deliberate provocations designed to ensure that the rebellion would unfold exactly as prophecy demanded. When Aerys executed Lord Rickard Stark and his son Brandon, he was not simply punishing rebels or sending a message to other potential enemies. He was fulfilling a ritual requirement that would bind the Stark bloodline to the coming conflict, ensuring that Ned Stark would be driven by more than political necessity to oppose the Targaryen regime. The fire that consumed Lord Rickard was not ordinary flame, but magical fire, kindled by the same power that had burned at Summerhall and would one day hatch the last dragons. As the Lord of Winterfell died, his spirit joined the cosmic forces that were working to prepare the world for the battles ahead. Brandon Stark's death by strangulation was equally significant. As he struggled against the device that slowly choked the life from him, his spirit was touched by the same magic that flowed through the heart trees and the ancient network of roots that connected all living things. His final moments created a psychic connection between the Stark bloodline and the mystical forces that would be needed to guide the prince that was promised to his destiny. Robert Baratheon's role in the rebellion was not that of a hero fighting for love and justice, as the songs would later claim. He was an unwitting agent of cosmic forces that needed a strong leader to unite the rebels and provide the military might necessary to bring down the Targaryen regime. Robert's legendary strength and battle prowess were not simply the result of natural gifts and training. His Baratheon blood carried within it traces of ancient magic, power that had been dormant for generations but was awakened by the approaching crisis. When he wielded his warhammer, he was channeling forces that connected him to the giants and the children of the forest, to the primal powers that had shaped the world in its youth. But Robert was also doomed to failure in the long term, for his temperament and character were not suited to the subtle manipulations that would be required in the years following his victory. His role was to serve as the hammer that would shatter the old order, clearing the way for the more complex work that would need to be done by others. Ned Stark's promise to his dying sister was not simply a personal vow to protect her infant son. It was the acceptance of a burden that would shape the rest of his life and the lives of his children. When Lyanna made him swear to keep Jon Snow's parentage secret, she was not just protecting the child from Robert's wrath. She was ensuring that the prince that was promised would be raised in the north, where the ancient magic of the First Men would strengthen his connection to the ice that he would one day need to command. The lie that Ned told about Jon's parentage was not a simple deception, but a form of blood magic, a deliberate shaping of reality that would protect the child until the moment came for his true heritage to be revealed. Every time Ned claimed Jon as his bastard, he was reinforcing magical bonds that would keep the boy safe from those who might seek to use or destroy him. Jon Snow's upbringing at Winterfell was not an accident of birth, but a carefully orchestrated preparation for his ultimate destiny. Living as a bastard taught him humility and compassion, qualities that would be essential when he faced the choice between personal glory and the greater good. Training with the Stark children gave him the skills he would need as a leader, while his exclusion from their true family prepared him for the isolation that would define his adult life. The direwolves that the Stark children found in the woods were not simply animals, but magical guardians sent by the old gods to protect the bloodlines that would be crucial in the coming war. Ghost John's albino wolf was marked from birth as different from his siblings, just as John himself was set apart by his true heritage. The wall, where John would eventually take his vows with the Night's Watch, was not simply a barrier of ice and stone, but a focal point for the magic that kept the others at bay. John's time there was not exile or punishment, but training, preparation for the moment when he would need to command the ancient powers that the wall represented. Jaime Lannister's decision to kill King Aerys was not simply the act of a young knight horrified by his king's madness. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy that required the Mad King to die at the hands of one sworn to protect him, a violation of sacred oaths that would create the magical conditions necessary for the next phase of the great pattern to unfold. When Jaime struck down Aerys, he was not just preventing the king from burning King's Landing with wildfire. He was completing a ritual that had begun with the deaths of the Starks, a sequence of noble sacrifices that would culminate in the birth of the prince that was promised. The sack of King's Landing that followed was not simply the result of Tywin Lannister's political calculations. It was a necessary cleansing, a purging of the old order that would clear the way for the new age that was approaching. The deaths of Prince Rhaegar's legitimate children were not mere casualties of war, but sacrificial offerings that would strengthen the magical bonds protecting his true heir. Even the Battle of the Trident, where Prince Rhaegar fell to Robert's hammer, served a purpose beyond the immediate political consequences. Rhaegar's death was not a failure or a tragedy, but a willing sacrifice, the final act of a man who had seen in his visions that his death would ensure his son's survival and eventual triumph. As Rhaegar lay dying in the waters of the Trident, his spirit joined those of his ancestors in the realm beyond death, where he would wait to guide his son when the moment came for the prince that was promised to fulfill his destiny. The rebellion that seemed to destroy House Targaryen was actually the mechanism by which the dynasty would be reborn, stronger and purer than before. The fall of the Dragon Kings was not an ending but a transformation, a metamorphosis that would prepare the bloodline for its final and greatest trial. Robert's victory was hollow, for he had won a throne that he was never meant to keep. His reign would be marked by decay and corruption, by the gradual weakening of the very forces that had brought him to power. The realm that he had fought to save would slowly crumble under his rule, preparing the ground for the return of the dragon and the fulfillment of the ancient prophecies. The cosmic design was complete. The pieces were in position. The prince that was promised had been born in the tower where ice and fire converged, carrying within his blood the power to save the world or see it consumed by darkness. All that remained was for time to pass, for the wheel to turn, and for the song of ice and fire to play out to its inevitable and terrible conclusion. The rebellion was over, but the real war had not yet begun. And when it came, the world would discover that every death, every betrayal, every moment of triumph and despair had been part of a pattern too vast for mortal minds to comprehend. A cosmic dance that would determine whether the sun would rise again or whether the long night would claim the world forever. In the aftermath of Robert's rebellion, as the Targaryen dynasty lay in ruins and the dragon banners were torn down from the walls of King's Landing, two children slipped away into the night, carrying with them the last hope of their ancient bloodline. Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen, the final scions of the Dragon Kings, began an exile that would span continents and decades, guided by forces they could not understand toward a destiny that would remake the world. But their flight from Dragonstone was not the desperate escape that the histories describe. It was a carefully orchestrated withdrawal, planned in the final days of the Mad King's reign by those who had foreseen the rebellion's success and understood what would need to happen for the Targaryen bloodline to survive and eventually triumph. The Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy reveals that Sir Willem Darry, the loyal knight who spirited the children away to safety, was not simply a faithful retainer doing his duty to his fallen king. He was the keeper of secrets that reached back to the very foundations of House Targaryen, a man who had been entrusted with knowledge that would prove crucial to the eventual return of dragons to the world. Hidden in the walls of Dragonstone, in chambers that had remained sealed since the conquest, Willem had discovered artifacts that the Targaryens had brought with them from old Valyria. Among these treasures were 3 dragon eggs, but not the stone-like relics that most people assumed were merely decorative reminders of a glorious past. These eggs were alive, waiting. They had been prepared through centuries of careful tending, their shells infused with the magical fires that had been kindled at Summerhall and strengthened by the blood sacrifices that had marked every generation of Targaryen rulers. The rituals that King Aegon V had begun in the flames of his palace had created the conditions necessary for these eggs to hatch, but the moment of their awakening was still decades away. The eggs were not random survivors from the Age of Dragons. Each had been chosen for a specific purpose, crafted by the ancient dragon lords of Valyria to serve a particular role in the cosmic balance between ice and fire. The first egg, black as a midnight sky and marked with deep red veins that pulsed like a beating heart, contained the spirit of Balerion the Black Dread. Not a reincarnation of the great dragon, but a new creature that would carry within its flames the accumulated wisdom and power of all the black dragons that had served House Targaryen throughout the centuries. The second egg, cream and gold like the dawn breaking over the eastern sea, held within it the potential for a dragon that would embody the pure fire of creation itself. This creature would be the bridge between the old magic of Valyria and the new power that would reshape the world in the age to come. The third egg, green as the depths of the ocean and scaled like a serpent from the deepest trenches, contained something that even the Chronicle describes with reverence and fear. This dragon would carry within its fire the power to unmake what had been made, to reduce the greatest works of men to ash and memory. But the eggs could not simply be carried to safety and waited upon to hatch in their own time. They required specific conditions to awaken, a combination of magical resonance, blood sacrifice, and cosmic alignment that would only occur once in 1,000 years. Sir Willem understood this, for he had been taught the ancient lore by masters who had studied the texts brought from Valyria. He knew that the children in his care were not simply the last survivors of a fallen dynasty, but the instruments through which the greatest magic the world had ever seen would be reborn. The years of exile that followed were not random wanderings through the free cities, as the casual observer might assume. Every destination, every patron who offered shelter, every hardship endured was part of a pattern designed to prepare Daenerys Targaryen for the moment when she would need to become something more than a queen. Viserys, though he would not live to see the dragon's return, played a crucial role in this preparation. His madness, his cruelty, his desperate clinging to dreams of restoration all served to teach Daenerys what it meant to be a true dragon. Through his failures, she learned the difference between ruling through fear and leading through love, between demanding obedience and inspiring loyalty. The golden crown that would eventually kill Viserys was not simply molten gold poured over his head by a barbarian king. It was a ritual execution, a sacrifice that would complete the magical preparations necessary for the dragon eggs to hatch. When the gold touched his skin, it was not just metal but liquid fire, the same substance that flowed in the veins of dragons and would soon flow in the flames of his sister's funeral pyre. The marriage between Daenerys and Khal Drogo was not a political alliance or a desperate attempt to gain military support for a Targaryen restoration. It was the fulfillment of a prophecy that required the blood of old Valyria to be joined with the blood of the Dothraki, whose ancestors had once ridden across the grass seas of Essos alongside the first dragons. The Dothraki were not simply nomadic horsemen, as most Westerosi believed. They were the descendants of the dragon riders who had served the lesser dragonlord families of Valyria, bloodlines that had fled east when the 14 flames erupted and had preserved their traditions in the vast grasslands beyond the free cities. Khal Drogo's strength was not merely physical. He carried within his blood the same draconic heritage that had once allowed his ancestors to bond with the great winged beasts, though this power had been dormant for so many generations that even the Dothraki themselves had forgotten their true origin. The wedding gifts that Daenerys received from the guests at her marriage were not random treasures offered to curry favor with a new Khaleesi. Each item had been chosen for its significance in the ritual that would eventually bring the dragons back to life. The 3 dragon eggs given by Magister Illyrio Mopatis were not the generous gift of a wealthy merchant seeking political advantage. Illyrio was a descendant of the Blackfyre line, carrying within his veins the bastard blood of Daemon Blackfyre, and he understood better than most the role that the scattered Targaryen bloodlines would play in the world's salvation. The eggs had been in his possession for decades, carefully tended by fire mages who had kept them warm with spells that reached back to the earliest days of Valyrian sorcery. When he placed them in Daenerys' hands, he was completing a transaction that had been arranged before her birth, fulfilling an obligation that his bloodline owed to the cosmic forces that had shaped both their destinies. The months that Daenerys spent with the Dothraki were not simply an education in the harsh realities of life among the Horse Lords. They were a spiritual preparation, a gradual awakening of the draconic power that lay dormant in her blood. Each day that she rode across the grass sea, each night that she slept under the open sky, each challenge that she faced and overcame was part of a process that was slowly transforming her from a frightened girl into something far more powerful and dangerous. The witch Mirri Maz Duda, whom history remembers as the healer who betrayed Daenerys and caused the death of her husband and unborn child, was actually a servant of the same cosmic forces that had guided House Targaryen for centuries. Her blood magic was not an attempt to harm the Khaleesi, but a necessary step in the ritual that would awaken the dragons. Mirri was a Magi, trained in the ancient arts that connected the world of the living to the realm of spirits and shadows. She could see the threads of fate that connected all things, and she understood that Khal Drogo's death was not a tragedy, but a requirement, a sacrifice that would provide the power needed to kindle the fires that would hatch the dragon eggs. When she performed a ritual that was meant to save Drogo's life, she was actually preparing his spirit for its transformation from mortal flesh to magical fire. The horror that Daenerys witnessed, the living death that claimed her husband, was not failure but success, the first stage of a process that would culminate in the funeral pyre where dragons would be reborn. The child that Daenerys lost, the son who would have been named Rhaego, was not simply a casualty of Mirri's magic. He was another offering to the cosmic forces that demanded payment in blood and suffering before they would grant the power to reshape reality itself. But the spirit of that unborn child was not lost. It merged with the magical currents that flowed through the eggs, becoming part of the life force that would animate the dragons when they finally hatched. In a sense, Rhaego would live again, not as a human prince, but as part of the great beasts that would carry his mother across the world. The funeral pyre where Khal Drogo's body was burned was not simply a Dothraki funeral rite. It was the culmination of a ritual that had begun centuries earlier in the flames of Summerhall, a ceremony that would complete the magical preparations necessary for the return of dragons to the world. When Daenerys stepped into the flames carrying the 3 eggs, she was not attempting suicide driven by grief and despair. She was fulfilling a destiny that had been written in fire and blood before her birth, becoming the bridge between the world of the dead and the realm of the living that would allow the dragons to cross back into mortal existence. The fire that surrounded her was not ordinary flame, but magical fire, the same substance that had burned in the forges of old Valyria and would one day melt the Iron Throne itself. It could not harm her because she had been prepared for this moment through years of suffering and loss, her body and spirit transformed by the draconic power that flowed in her veins. As the flames consumed everything around her, the eggs began to crack and split, releasing the spirits that had been waiting within for their moment of rebirth. The dragons that emerged were not simply animals but magical constructs, creatures whose very existence was a violation of the natural order and a triumph of will over reality. Drogon, black and red like the flames that had given him birth, carried within his fire the power to destroy armies and melt stone. Rhaegal, green and bronze like the grass sea where he was born, would become the mount of the prince that was promised, the dragon whose flames would light the way through the long night. Viserion, cream and gold like his mother's hair, would serve as the bridge between ice and fire, his light showing the path to salvation even as his flames were transformed by the touch of winter. The return of dragons to the world marked the beginning of the end of the Age of Men and the dawn of something entirely new. Magic flowed back into the world like a tide, awakening powers that had slept for centuries and setting in motion events that would culminate in the greatest war that had ever been fought. But the dragons were not simply weapons to be used in the conflicts ahead. They were guardians, protectors of the cosmic balance that kept the world from tipping into either eternal fire or endless ice. Their return was not a restoration of the past, but a preparation for a future that would require sacrifices beyond anything that had come before. As Daenerys stood among the ashes of the funeral pyre, her dragons coiled around her like living jewelry. She had become something that the world had not seen since the doom of Valyria. She was the mother of dragons, the last Dragon Lord, the woman who would either save the world or watch it burn. The exile was over. The dragons had returned, and the final act of the cosmic drama that had been playing out for centuries was about to begin. When dawn broke over the Dothraki Sea and revealed Daenerys Targaryen standing unburned among the ashes of her husband's funeral pyre, 3 dragons coiled around her body like living crowns, the world witnessed something that had not occurred since the doom of Valyria. But what most observers saw as a miracle was actually the culmination of magical workings that had begun in the deepest past. When the first men walked the earth and the children of the forest sang to the heart trees under starlit skies, the dragons that had hatched in the flames were not simply the offspring of long-dead creatures brought back to life through blood magic and funeral fire. They were the physical manifestation of ancient pacts that had been forged between the cosmic forces of ice and fire, agreements that reached back to the very creation of the world and forward to its ultimate fate. In the moments before the eggs cracked open and released their miraculous contents, Daenerys had experienced visions that showed her the true nature of what was occurring. She saw herself standing not in the Dothraki grasslands, but in the heart of old Valyria, surrounded by the 14 flames in their full glory, witnessing the first dragon binding ritual ever performed by mortal hands. The ancient dragon lords had not created dragons through breeding or magic, as most histories suggested. They had summoned them from another realm entirely, calling forth spirits of pure fire and binding them into physical forms that could exist in the mortal world. The creatures that had served the Valyrian freehold for centuries were not animals but elemental beings, forces of creation made flesh through the will and sacrifice of those who dared to command them. But the binding of fire spirits required a cosmic balance. For every dragon that was called into the world, an equal and opposite force had to be acknowledged and appeased. The dragon lords of old Valyria had made their pact not just with fire but with ice, agreeing that when the time came for the final reckoning, their descendants would serve both forces in the great war that would determine the fate of all life. This was the true meaning of the Song of Ice and Fire. It was not a prophecy about individual heroes or dynasties rising and falling. It was the fundamental rhythm of reality itself, the eternal dance between creation and destruction, summer and winter, life and death. When the eggs hatched in Daenerys's pyre, they were not simply being warmed back to life by magical flames. They were being summoned across the barriers between worlds, called from the realm of pure spirit into physical existence by a ritual that had been planned and prepared for centuries. The three dragons that emerged carried within their flames not just the power of fire, but the memories and purposes of all the dragons that had served House Targaryen throughout history. Drogon, the largest and fiercest, bore the spirit of Balerion the Black Dread and the accumulated might of all the black dragons that had ever lived. His flames could melt steel and stone, but more importantly, they could burn away the magical protections that shielded the servants of the Night King. Rhaegal, green and bronze like the grasslands where he was born, carried within his fire the wild magic of the children of the forest and the ancient power of the weirwood trees. His flames were not just destructive, but transformative, capable of awakening dormant magic in the blood of those he touched and of revealing truths that had been hidden by time and deception. The Viserion, cream and gold like summer sunlight, was perhaps the most important of the three, though his significance would not become apparent until much later. His fire burned with the pure light of creation itself, the same radiance that had shone when the world was young and the barriers between the realms were thin. He would be the key to bridging the gap between ice and fire, the dragon whose sacrifice would make possible the final victory over the darkness. But the birth of the dragons did more than simply restore the Targaryens' ancient power. It sent ripples through the magical currents that connected all living things, awakening abilities and memories that had lain dormant for generations. Across the narrow sea in Westeros, Brandon Stark felt the moment when the dragons took their first breath. The fall that had left him crippled had also opened his mind to the mystical network that connected all life through the roots of the weirwood trees, and through this connection he sensed the return of his family's ancient enemies and allies. But Brandon's awakening was not random chance. The Stark bloodline carried within it memories that reached back to the first long night, when the kings of winter had stood alongside the last heroes in the war against the others. The return of dragons was the signal that this ancient war was about to resume and that the Starks would once again be called upon to fulfill their role in the cosmic balance. Jon Snow, though he did not yet know his true parentage, felt the moment of the dragon's birth as a stirring in his blood, a warmth that spread through his veins like molten gold. His direwolf ghost sensed it too, lifting his head toward the eastern sky and howling with a voice that carried across the wall and into the haunted forest beyond. The Night's Watch had been founded not just to guard against wildling raids or even the return of the others, but to serve as the guardians of the ancient pacts that kept the cosmic forces in balance. When dragons returned to the world, it was inevitable that ice would respond with equal power, and the Watch would need to be ready for the war that would determine the fate of all mankind. In the lands beyond the wall, in the deepest forests where no human foot had trod for 1,000 years, ancient eyes opened that had been closed since the last dragon died. The Night King, who had slumbered in his palace of ice while magic faded from the world, felt the flames of the newborn dragons like burning needles in his frozen heart. The pact that had ended the first long night was not a treaty between human kingdoms and the creatures of ice and shadow. It was a cosmic agreement between the fundamental forces that shaped reality, a promise that neither ice nor fire would gain permanent dominance over the world. When dragons had died out and magic had faded, the balance had shifted toward ice, and the others had begun their slow preparations for a return to power. But now dragons lived again, and the balance was shifting back toward fire. The Night King understood that he had perhaps a decade to complete his own preparations before the war would begin in earnest, and that this time there would be no negotiated peace, no pact to restore equilibrium. One side would triumph completely, or the world would be consumed in the conflict between them. The woman who stood among the ashes of the funeral pyre, her silver hair stirring in winds that carried the heat of her dragon's breath, was no longer simply Daenerys Targaryen, exiled princess of a fallen dynasty. She had become something that the world had not seen since the earliest days of Valyria. She was a dragon lord in the truest sense, a mortal being who had bound her soul to creatures of elemental fire and accepted the terrible responsibility that came with such power. But the pacts that had made the dragon's birth possible came with obligations that even Daenerys did not fully understand. She had become the champion of fire in the cosmic war that was approaching, but that role required more than simply commanding dragons in battle. She would need to make choices that would determine not just the fate of the Seven Kingdoms, but the future of all life on Earth. The first of these choices came sooner than anyone expected. As the dragons grew from hatchlings to young adults, their presence began to awaken other forms of magic that had been sleeping throughout the world. The warlocks of Karth felt their power returning. The red priests of Rola saw their flames burn brighter, and in the deepest vaults of the citadel, the Maesters watched with growing alarm as their carefully hoarded stores of magical artifacts began to pulse with renewed life. But magic's return was not uniformly beneficial. For every miracle of healing or prophecy that manifested, there were darker consequences as well. Ancient curses that had been weakening for centuries suddenly regained their potency. Creatures that had retreated to the deepest places of the earth began to stir once more. And in the far north, beyond the wall, the army of the dead began to march. The dragons themselves seemed to understand their role in these events better than their mother did. When they were still young enough to perch on her shoulders, they would often gaze northward with an intensity that suggested they could see across the hundreds of leagues that separated them from the wall. They knew that their true enemy was not the petty kings and queens who squabbled over the Iron Throne, but the ancient force that sought to extinguish all warmth and light from the world. As Daenerys began her conquests in Slaver's Bay, liberating cities and breaking chains, she was unconsciously fulfilling another aspect of the ancient pacts. The war between ice and fire could not be fought by dragons and their riders alone. It would require armies of unprecedented size, united by bonds stronger than fear or gold. The freed slaves who followed Daenerys were not simply grateful subjects or opportunistic followers seeking advantage from her success. They were the human element in the cosmic balance, the mortal hearts that would give meaning to the struggle between elemental forces. Their love for the woman who had broken their chains was what would transform a war between abstract powers into something worth fighting for. But the pacts that governed the return of magic also contained warnings about the price that would ultimately be required. The dragons could not simply exist in the world indefinitely, any more than the others could be allowed to freeze it permanently. When the war was over, regardless of which side emerged victorious, the cosmic balance would need to be restored through sacrifice. The visions that had begun to plague Daenerys' dreams showed her glimpses of this ultimate requirement. She saw herself standing in the ruins of King's Landing, her dragons circling overhead as snow began to fall from a sky that had been clear moments before. She saw the Iron Throne melting under dragon fire, its 1,000 swords returning to the raw metal from which they had been forged. Most disturbing of all, she saw herself walking into flames once more, but this time not to hatch dragons, but to unmake them, to return their spirits to the realm beyond the world so that the cosmic balance could be restored. These visions terrified her more than any enemy army or political crisis ever had, for they suggested that her ultimate destiny was not to rule but to sacrifice everything she had gained for the preservation of the world itself. The dragons she loved as her own children, the power that had allowed her to break chains and topple kingdoms, the very magic that flowed in her veins, all of it would need to be given up when the final moment came. But such thoughts were for the future. In the present, there were cities to conquer, slaves to free, and enemies to face. The dragons were growing stronger with each passing day, their flames burning hotter and their bond with their mother deepening. The armies that followed her were becoming not just soldiers but believers, convinced that they served not merely a queen but a force of destiny itself. The ancient pacts had been fulfilled. Dragons lived again, and magic flowed through the world like a river returning to its channel after a long drought. The cosmic balance was shifting, and soon the Night King would respond with powers that had not been seen since the first long night darkened the world. The real war was about to begin, and when it did, every soul in the world would discover whether the pacts forged in the dawn of time were strong enough to preserve the light of creation, or whether the darkness would finally claim its ultimate victory. The moment that 3 dragons drew their first breath in the ashes of Khal Drogo's funeral pyre, every person with even a trace of magical ability felt the change ripple through the world like a stone cast into still water. But what most experienced as a subtle shift in the currents of fate was actually the breaking of bonds that had held the deepest powers of creation in check for more than a century. Magic had not truly died when the last Targaryen dragons perished during the Dance of Dragons. It had merely retreated, flowing into hidden channels and secret places where it waited for the proper conditions to emerge once more into the light. The return of dragons was not the cause of magic's revival, but the key that unlocked chambers of power that had been sealed since the doom of Valyria. In the citadel of Old Town, where the Maesters had spent centuries cataloging and controlling the remnants of the old arts, ancient texts began to glow with inner light. Scrolls that had been dormant for generations suddenly burst into flame, not to be destroyed, but to reveal hidden words written in inks that only became visible when touched by draconic fire. The obsidian candles that had refused to burn for decades suddenly blazed with black flames that cast no shadows but revealed truths that had been hidden in darkness. Grand Maester Pycelle, though he would never admit it to his brothers in the chain, felt the moment of awakening like a sword thrust through his heart. The magical suppressions and careful poisonings that had kept his body functioning decades past its natural span were suddenly reinforced 100-fold, his life extended not by careful alchemy, but by forces that drew power from the dragons themselves. But the Maesters were not the only ones to feel the change. In the Sept of Bysela, the great crystal that focused the light of the Seven began to pulse with rhythms that matched the beating of dragon hearts half a world away. The High Septon, kneeling in prayer before the altar, experienced visions that showed him the true nature of the gods he served. They were not separate deities but aspects of the same cosmic forces that had shaped the world from its beginning, manifestations of the eternal struggle between creation and destruction that found its purest expression in the Song of Ice and Fire. The Red Priests of Ruler felt the awakening most keenly of all. In temples from Volantis to Ashai, sacred flames that had burned low for decades suddenly roared to life with such intensity that several buildings were consumed in the inferno. The priests emerged from these fires unburned, their skin glowing with inner light, and their eyes reflecting flames that seemed to burn without fuel. Melisandre of Ashai, serving at the wall in the far north of Westeros, witnessed her own transformation with a mixture of awe and terror. The glamours and illusions that had maintained her appearance for centuries were suddenly reinforced by power that flowed directly from the dragons across the sea. But more importantly, her ability to see into the flames was magnified beyond anything she had ever experienced. In the dancing fire of her brazier, she saw the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. The Lord of Light and the Great Other were not gods locked in eternal conflict, but forces of nature seeking balance. The war that was coming would determine not which deity would triumph, but whether equilibrium could be maintained between powers that could each destroy the world if left unchecked. The children of the forest, those few who still remained in the deepest places of the earth, felt the dragon's birth as a warming in their ancient hearts. They had withdrawn from the world of men not out of defeat or despair, but because they understood that their time of active guardianship was ending, and a new age was beginning. The return of dragons meant that the cosmic wheel was turning once more, bringing them toward their final role in the great pattern. Through the network of roots that connected every weirwood tree in the known world, they sent messages to those who still carried the old blood in their veins. The Starks felt these whispers as half-remembered dreams, visions of their ancestors standing alongside the children in battles against creatures of ice and shadow. The Reeds of Greywater Watch, whose bloodline had never fully separated from the First Men, experienced the awakening as a return of abilities their family had not possessed for generations. But nowhere was the return of magic more dramatically felt than beyond the Wall, in the lands of endless winter, where the others had been building their strength during the long years of draconic absence. The Night King, seated on his throne of black ice in the heart of the land of always winter, felt the moment of the dragon's birth like a blade of fire thrust into his frozen heart. The balance that had kept him dormant was shifting once more toward fire, and he understood that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. For centuries he had been gathering the scattered remnants of his ancient army, calling back spirits that had been dispersed when the last long night ended. Now he would need to accelerate his plans, to strike before the dragons grew large enough to threaten his forces directly. The Wall itself began to respond to the changing magical currents that flowed through the world. The ancient spells woven into its foundation by Brandon the Builder, reinforced by centuries of Night's Watch vows and strengthened by the sacrifice of those who had died defending it, suddenly blazed with renewed power. But this reinforcement came with a cost. The magic that protected the realm of men was drawing energy from the same source that fed the dragons, creating a connection that the Night King could potentially exploit. Jon Snow, though he did not yet understand the significance of what he was experiencing, felt these changes more keenly than anyone else at Castle Black. His dreams were filled with visions of fire and ice locked in combat, of ancient battles fought beneath skies lit by dragon flame and northern lights. His direwolf ghost seemed to understand what was happening better than his master did, often standing at the edge of the wall and staring north with eyes that reflected not natural light, but the glow of magic itself. The wildlings beyond the Wall experienced the return of magic as both blessing and curse. Those few who still remembered the old ways found their abilities restored and magnified. For skin changers, who had barely been able to slip into the minds of common animals, suddenly discovered they could soar with eagles or run with shadow cats. Greenseers, who had possessed only the faintest touch of the sight, found themselves capable of communing directly with the heart trees. But the return of magic also awakened things that had been better left sleeping. In the deepest caves and forgotten ruins of the far north, creatures that had not stirred since the first long night began to move once more. Ice spiders the size of horses emerged from their lairs, their crystalline eyes reflecting the cold light of the aurora. Giants who had retreated to the most remote valleys found their strength increased tenfold, their connection to the ancient earth magic allowing them to move mountains with their bare hands. Most disturbing of all, the dead began to answer calls that they had ignored for centuries. The Night King's power to raise and command whites had been severely limited during the years when magic lay dormant, but now every corpse in the frozen north became a potential addition to his army. The comet that had appeared in the sky around the time of the dragon's birth was not a natural astronomical phenomenon, but a visible manifestation of the magical energies that were reshaping the world. Its blood-red light touched minds across 2 continents, awakening dormant abilities and revealing hidden truths to those who had the wisdom to interpret what they saw. In the free cities of Essos, warlocks and sorcerers who had been reduced to performing parlor tricks for coins suddenly found themselves capable of feats that would have been impressive even in the days of old Valyria. The House of the Undying in Koth became a nexus of power once more, its halls filled with visions that showed possible futures branching out like the limbs of a great tree. The faceless men of Braavos discovered that their god of death was stirring from the deep slumber that had claimed him during the years of magical drought. The many-faced god was not simply death personified, but the force of entropy that balanced the creative power of dragons, ensuring that nothing in the world became so powerful that it could upset the cosmic equilibrium permanently. But perhaps the most significant awakening occurred in a place that few would have expected: the crypts of Winterfell, where the kings of winter had been entombed for thousands of years. The iron swords placed across their laps, meant to keep the spirits of the dead at rest, began to glow with cold fire as the ancient magic woven into Winterfell's foundations responded to the return of dragons. The castle itself was not simply a fortress, but a focus for the power that flowed through the north, built on the same principles that had shaped the wall, but designed to channel magic inward rather than keep it out. When dragons returned to the world, Winterfell became what it had always been meant to be: a beacon that would guide the forces of ice and fire toward their final confrontation. Bran Stark's fall from the tower had not been an accident, but a necessary sacrifice, though none who witnessed it understood its true significance. His broken body became a conduit for the ancient power that slept beneath Winterfell, allowing him to access the network of roots and memories that connected all living things. Through his newfound abilities, he began to perceive the vast pattern that connected every event in the world, the cosmic design that had been guiding history toward this moment of awakening. The three-eyed raven that appeared in his dreams was not simply a wise teacher offering cryptic guidance. It was the last remnant of the children of the forest's collective consciousness, the repository of all the knowledge and wisdom that the elder races had accumulated over millennia of guardianship. As magic flowed back into the world like a tide returning to the shore, it became clear that the age of skepticism and scientific inquiry that had characterized the recent centuries was ending. The Meister's attempts to explain away the supernatural, the nobles' dismissal of prophecy and vision, the common people's relegation of magic to fireside tales, all of these attitudes would prove insufficient for the challenges that lay ahead. The world was becoming magical once more, but this was not a return to some golden age of wonder and possibility. It was preparation for a war that would determine whether the forces of creation or destruction would ultimately shape the future of all life. Every person who felt the change, from the greatest lords to the humblest peasants, was being called to choose a side in a conflict that most could not even comprehend. The dragons had returned, but so had their ancient enemies. Magic flowed through the world once more, but it carried with it the potential for both salvation and annihilation. The cosmic balance was shifting, and soon everyone would discover whether the return of magic would herald a new dawn for humanity or the beginning of its final night. In the deepest vaults of the citadel, where books bound in human skin rested alongside scrolls written in the blood of dragons, there existed a single tome that no maester had dared to open for more than 3 centuries. The Chronicle of the End Times, written by the last survivors of old Valyria in the hours before the 14 flames consumed their civilization, contained prophecies so terrible that those who read them often took their own lives rather than live with the knowledge of what was coming. But as dragons returned to the world and magic flowed through the realm like wine through a drunkard's veins, the ancient seals that bound this forbidden book began to crack and crumble. The parchment pages, preserved by arts that reached beyond mortal understanding, began to glow with letters of fire that spelled out the ultimate truth about the cosmic forces that shaped reality. The long night that threatened to return was not simply a season of cold and darkness, as even the most learned historians believed. It was the universe itself beginning to tip toward entropy, toward a state where the fundamental forces that maintained the balance between creation and destruction would collapse entirely. The entity that had been released from beneath the 14 flames when Valyria burned was not the Night King, as some had assumed. It was something far older and more terrible, the Heart of Winter, the primordial force of ending that had existed since the first moment of creation. For millions of years, this cosmic power had been held in check by the equally ancient force of eternal flame. the two locked in a balance that allowed life to flourish in the narrow space between absolute heat and absolute cold. But the dragon lords of Valyria, in their arrogance and hunger for power, had unknowingly weakened the barriers that kept these primordial forces contained. Their sorcery had drawn energy from the heart of winter itself, using its power to fuel their dragons and their empire. With each spell cast, each dragon hatched, each act of magic performed, they had been slowly draining the cosmic balance that protected the world from forces that could unmake reality itself. The doom of Valyria was not caused by volcanic eruption or magical accident. It was the moment when the heart of winter, finally freed from its ancient prison, began its inexorable journey toward the world of mortals. The destruction of the freehold was merely its first act, a demonstration of the power it would bring to bear against all living things. The Night King was not the master of winter, but its servant, the first mortal to be touched by the heart of winter and transformed into a vessel for its will. The army of the dead that marched behind him was not his creation, but the advance guard of entropy itself, the beginning of a process that would ultimately reduce all life to silent ice and shadow. This was the truth that had driven so many Targaryens to apparent madness over the centuries. They had not been seeing random visions of future catastrophe, but glimpses of the ultimate fate that awaited the world if the cosmic balance could not be restored. Their prophecies of the prince that was promised, the song of ice and fire, the three heads of the dragon, all of these were desperate attempts to chart a course through the maze of destiny that might lead to salvation rather than extinction. The Iron Throne was not simply a seat of political power, but a magical artifact designed to focus the will of those who sat upon it toward the preservation of the world. The 1,000 swords from which it was forged had been chosen not for their symbolic value, but for their metaphysical properties. Each blade had been wielded in battle against the forces of entropy, and their metal contained traces of the cosmic fire that could stand against the heart of winter. This was why the throne cut those who sat upon it, why it rejected those who were unworthy to rule. It was not made for comfort, but for purpose. Designed to remind its occupants that power came with the ultimate responsibility to serve as the final barrier between the world of the living and the realm of eternal ending. King's Landing itself had been built according to principles that most of its inhabitants could never understand. The city's layout followed patterns that channeled magical energy toward the Red Keep, while the Sept and the Dragon Pit served as focal points for the spiritual forces that would be needed when the final battle came. Even the sewers and the lowest levels of the city had been designed with cosmic significance, their tunnels and chambers forming a mystical mandala that would concentrate the power of those who defended the realm. The wildfire that King Aerys II had hidden throughout the city was not meant to be a weapon of spite or revenge. It was designed to serve as a ritual fire, a massive magical working that would transform King's Landing into a beacon of cosmic flame, capable of holding back the darkness even if every other defense failed. The Mad King had seen in his visions that the capital would be the final battleground, the place where the fate of all creation would be decided. The wall was not simply a barrier of ice and magic designed to keep the others at bay. It was a vast, mystical construct that channeled the power of the heart of winter toward a single point, concentrating the force of entropy so that it could be more easily contained and controlled. The Night's Watch were not simply guardians of the realm, but priests of a cosmic religion, their vows binding them to serve the balance between ice and fire, even unto death. When the dragons returned to the world, they brought with them not just magical power, but cosmic awareness. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion were not simply animals, but fragments of the eternal flame made manifest, creatures whose very existence was a challenge to the forces of ending. Their growth from hatchlings to adult dragons paralleled the growing strength of the creative forces that opposed entropy, each new scale and each hotter flame adding to the cosmic balance. But the dragons also carried within their fire the seeds of their own destruction. The ancient pacts that had allowed them to exist in the mortal world contained provisions for their eventual sacrifice, acknowledgments that even the force of creation could become destructive if left unchecked. When the time came to restore the cosmic balance, the dragons would need to give up their lives just as willingly as their enemies. Bran Stark's transformation into the three-eyed raven was not simply the awakening of green sight, or the ability to see through the eyes of animals. He was becoming something that transcended mortal existence, a living embodiment of the cosmic memory that connected all things across time and space. Through his consciousness, the accumulated wisdom of every creature that had ever lived could be focused toward the moment of ultimate decision. The prince that was promised was not a single individual but a convergence of bloodlines and purposes that would create a being capable of standing at the intersection of ice and fire. Jon Snow carried within his veins the blood of the kings of winter and the fire of the dragons, but more importantly, he carried the spiritual heritage of sacrifice that would allow him to choose the preservation of the world over his own desires. The three heads of the dragon were not simply three dragon riders who would fight in the final battle. They were three aspects of the cosmic principle that opposed entropy, creation, preservation, and transformation. Daenerys embodied the creative force that brought new life into the world. Jon represented the preserving power that protected what already existed, and the third head, whose identity remained hidden in the mists of prophecy, would serve as the agent of transformation that would reshape reality itself. The war that was approaching would not be fought with swords and dragons alone, though these would play their part. It would be a battle for the fundamental nature of existence, a struggle to determine whether the universe would continue to support life and growth, or whether it would collapse into the perfect stillness of absolute entropy. The army of the dead was not simply the Night King's weapon, but a manifestation of the universe's tendency toward decay and ending. Every wight that rose from its grave, every White Walker that emerged from the far north, was a symptom of the cosmic imbalance that threatened to unravel the very fabric of reality. But the living also had their role to play in the cosmic drama. Every act of love, every moment of courage, every choice to create rather than destroy added to the forces that opposed the heart of winter. The freed slaves who followed Daenerys, the Night's Watch brothers who defended the wall, the common people who continued to plant crops and raise children despite the approaching darkness. All of them were soldiers in the war for the soul of existence itself. The prophecies spoke of a dawn that would follow the longest night, but this was not simply a promise that winter would eventually give way to spring. It was a guarantee that if the right choices were made, if the necessary sacrifices were offered, the cosmic balance could be restored, and the world could continue to exist in the narrow space between the extremes of fire and ice. The key to victory lay not in the defeat of the Night King, or even the destruction of the army of the dead. It lay in the willingness of those who carried the dragon seed to give up everything they had gained, to sacrifice their power and their lives for the restoration of the cosmic equilibrium that would allow the world to continue. The Iron Throne would need to be destroyed, not by conquest but by choice. Its power returned to the cosmic forces from which it had been drawn. The dragons would need to die, not in battle, but in willing sacrifice, their spirits released to rejoin the eternal flame from which they had come. The magic that had returned to the world would need to be reduced to manageable levels, its wild power channeled into forms that would not upset the delicate balance between creation and destruction. The long night was returning, but so was the knowledge of how to end it. The ancient pacts could be renewed, the cosmic balance could be restored, and the world could be saved. But the price would be higher than anyone imagined, and the choices that would determine the fate of all existence would need to be made by those who understood that true power lay not in ruling, but in knowing when to let go. The final revelation was complete. The ultimate enemy was not the Night King or the army of the dead, but entropy itself, the force of ending that sought to reduce all existence to perfect, silent stillness. The war that was coming would determine whether life would continue to flourish in the cosmos, or whether the universe would collapse into the eternal winter of absolute zero. The choice belonged to the living, and the moment of decision was approaching with the inevitability of dawn following the darkest night. In the final days before the long night's return, when the dead began to march, and the living huddled behind walls that seemed thinner with each passing hour, the truth about the prince that was promised finally emerged from the shadows of prophecy where it had hidden for millennia. The figure that Azor Ahai had glimpsed in his visions was not a single person, but a convergence of bloodlines, destinies, and cosmic forces that would create a being capable of standing at the junction between ice and fire. Jon Snow, born of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen in the Tower of Joy, carried within his blood the heritage of both winter and flame, but his significance went far beyond his parentage. The Tower of Joy itself had been chosen for reasons that reached back to the first days of the world. It stood at the exact center of a confluence of magical currents that had been shaped by the children of the forest in the Dawn Age, a place where the power of the old gods met the fire of the new. When Jon drew his first breath in that ancient place, he was not simply being born but being forged, his soul shaped by forces that understood the role he would need to play in the battles ahead. The wet nurse who had attended his birth was not the simple Dornish woman that Ned Stark had claimed, but Willa, a descendant of the last priests of the drowned god who had served the ancient magic of the sea. Her milk had been blessed with the power of tides and depths, ensuring that the child who would become the prince that was promised would carry within him not just fire and ice, but the fluid strength of water that could flow around any obstacle and wear down any opposition. The name that Lyanna had whispered to her brother as she died was not simply Jon, but Jaehaerys, a recognition that this child would carry the burden of all the Targaryen kings who had come before him. But Ned's decision to call him Jon Snow was not born from shame or the need to hide his identity. It was a deliberate choice that connected the boy to Jon Arryn, the hand of the king who had understood better than most the cosmic forces that shaped the realm. Jon Arryn had been more than a political leader or military commander. He had been initiated into the deepest mysteries of the old gods during his youth in the Vale, where the mountain peaks touched the sky and ancient powers still flowed through the stone. His death at the hands of Lysa Tully was not born from her madness or ambition, but from his discovery of the truth about the prince that was promised, and his attempts to prepare the realm for what was coming. The bastard name Snow carried its own significance, connecting Jon to the ancient power of winter that flowed through his mother's bloodline. Each snowflake that fell in the god's wood of Winterfell was a reminder of the cosmic forces that had shaped his destiny, and when he walked among the heart trees, he could feel the spirits of the kings of winter watching him with eyes that burned like cold stars. His upbringing among the Stark children was not simply the result of Ned's honor and love for his sister. It was a deliberate preparation for the role he would need to play when the final battle came. Living as a bastard taught him humility without breaking his spirit, while training alongside true-born children gave him the skills he would need to lead armies and inspire loyalty. The dire wolf that had bonded with him in the woods south of Winterfell was not simply an animal companion, but a fragment of the old gods made manifest. Ghost's white fur and red eyes marked him as a creature that existed at the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of spirits, able to guide his master through the liminal spaces where ordinary mortals could not survive. When Jon took the Black and joined the Night's Watch, he was not abandoning his family or fleeing from his bastard status. He was accepting the first stage of his true destiny, taking vows that would prepare him for the ultimate sacrifice that would be required when the long night returned. The wall itself recognized him from the moment he first touched its ancient ice. The spells that Brandon the Builder had woven into its foundation, reinforced by centuries of Night's Watch vows and strengthened by the blood of those who had died defending it, responded to the presence of someone who carried both the fire of dragons and the ice of winter within his veins. His time beyond the wall, living among the wildlings and learning their ways, was not simply a mission of espionage or diplomacy. It was an education in the primal forces that shaped the far north, an introduction to the magic that flowed through the lands where the others dwelt. When he fell in love with Ygritte, he was not simply experiencing the passion of youth, but forging a connection to the ancient power of the free folk, whose ancestors had fought alongside the last heroes in the first war against the darkness. The betrayal that led to his death at the hands of his Night's Watch brothers was not born from their cowardice or short-sightedness, but from their unconscious understanding that his transformation could not be completed while he remained bound by mortal limitations. His murder was not treachery, but sacrifice, the willing offering of his life, so that he could be reborn as something greater than human. When Melisandre called him back from the realm of the dead, she was not simply performing a miracle of resurrection, but completing a ritual that had been planned since his birth. The fires that surrounded his body as he returned to life were not ordinary flames, but cosmic fire, the same force that had kindled the first dragons and would light the way through the final darkness. But Jon's resurrection came with a price that even Melisandre did not fully understand. He returned to life, carrying within him not just his own memories and experiences, but the accumulated wisdom of all those who had died in the service of the cosmic balance. The spirits of the kings of winter spoke to him through the wind that howled across the wall, while the ghosts of dead dragons whispered guidance through the flames that danced in his presence. His true parentage, when it was finally revealed, was not simply a matter of political legitimacy or dynastic succession. It was the confirmation that he carried within his blood the precise combination of forces that would be needed to stand against the heart of winter itself. The ice of the Starks and the fire of the Targaryens had been joined in him not by chance but by cosmic design, creating a being who could command both the creative power of dragons and the preserving strength of winter. When he learned to ride Rhaegal, the dragon that had been named for his father, he was not simply mastering a powerful mount, but forging a connection to the eternal flame that burned at the heart of creation. The green and bronze dragon had been waiting for him since the moment of its hatching, its spirit attuned to the same forces that flowed through Jon's veins. The battles that he fought in the wars that followed were not simply military campaigns but mystical trials, each victory preparing him for the ultimate confrontation that would determine the fate of all existence. When he led the living against the army of the dead at Winterfell, he was not just commanding soldiers but channeling the accumulated power of every hero who had ever stood against the darkness. But the prophecy of the prince that was promised contained a cruel irony that even the wisest seers had not fully understood. The champion who would save the world from the long night would not do so through victory in battle or the defeat of his enemies. He would triumph through sacrifice, by choosing to give up everything he had gained for the preservation of the cosmic balance. The throne that he could have claimed by right of birth would need to be destroyed rather than occupied. The dragons that served his bloodline would need to die rather than multiply. The magic that had returned to the world would need to be channeled back into the cosmic forces from which it had come, leaving the realm diminished but stable. Most painful of all, the love that he had found with Daenerys Targaryen would need to be sacrificed on the altar of duty. The aunt who had become his lover carried within her the creative force of pure fire, but that same power made her dangerous to the cosmic balance that needed to be restored. When madness claimed her in the final days of the war, it was not born from cruelty or ambition, but from the overwhelming presence of draconic power that her mortal soul could no longer contain. The choice that Jon faced in the throne room of the Red Keep, when he stood before the woman he loved as she spoke of burning cities and breaking wheels, was not simply personal but cosmic. He could allow her to reshape the world according to her vision, knowing that the forces she commanded would eventually tip the balance so far toward fire that ice would respond with equal fury. or he could make the sacrifice that the prophecies demanded, ending the threat she posed while destroying a part of his own soul in the process. When he drove the dagger into her heart, he was not committing murder, but completing a ritual that had been written into the fabric of reality itself. Her death was not tragedy, but transformation, her spirit joining the cosmic forces that would ensure the world's survival, while her body returned to the elements from which it had been formed. The dragon that melted the Iron Throne was not acting from grief or rage, but from cosmic understanding. Drogon recognized that the seat of power had served its purpose and needed to be unmade, its metal returning to the raw materials from which it had been forged. The destruction of the throne was not the end of an era, but the beginning of a new age, one in which power would be shared rather than concentrated, balanced rather than absolute. Jon's final exile to the lands beyond the Wall was not punishment but fulfillment, the completion of his transformation from bastard prince to cosmic guardian. In the forests where the children of the forest still dwelt, among the free folk who understood the primal forces that shaped the world, he would serve as the bridge between the realm of mortals and the powers that protected it from the forces of entropy. The prince that was promised had fulfilled his destiny, not through conquest but through sacrifice, not by claiming power, but by knowing when to let it go. The long night had been ended not by the defeat of the Night King, but by the restoration of the cosmic balance that kept the universe from tipping toward either absolute fire or eternal ice. In the songs that would be sung in the ages to come, Jon Snow would be remembered not as a king who ruled but as a guardian who watched, not as a conqueror who claimed but as a protector who preserved. The prince that was promised had saved the world by choosing to give up everything, including the recognition that his sacrifice deserved. The prophecy was complete, the balance restored, and the world safe for another age. But the price of salvation would echo through the generations, a reminder that the greatest heroes were often those who chose duty over desire, sacrifice over glory, the preservation of the world over the fulfillment of their own dreams. As the smoke cleared from the ruins of King's Landing and the last echoes of Dragonfire faded into memory, the world began to settle into a new rhythm, one that had not been heard since the earliest days of creation. The wheel that had turned for millennia, crushing those beneath it while lifting others to impossible heights, had finally been broken, not through force or revolution, but through the willing sacrifice of those who had possessed the power to keep it spinning. In the quiet chambers beneath Dragonstone, where the chronicle of blood and prophecy had waited through centuries of war and peace, the ancient tome began to write its final entries. The quill moved across the parchment without any hand to guide it, inscribed by the same cosmic forces that had shaped the destinies of kings and beggars alike. The words that appeared spoke not of conquest or glory, but of balance restored and peace earned through sacrifice. The dragons were gone, their spirits returned to the eternal flame from which they had been called. Drogon had carried his mother's body across the narrow sea to the lands where old Valyria had once stood, laying her to rest among the ruins of the civilization that had given birth to her bloodline. There, in the shadow of the 14 flames, he had sung a song of mourning that echoed across the known world, a lament for the age of dragons that had finally come to its end. But his grief was not despair, for he understood what mortal minds could not fully grasp. The Age of Dragons had served its purpose, protecting the world through its darkest hours, and ensuring that the forces of creation would triumph over the pull of entropy. Now that the cosmic balance had been restored, the great beasts could rest, their duty complete, and their sacrifice honored by the continuation of the world they had helped to save. The Iron Throne lay melted in the ruins of the Red Keep, its 1,000 swords returned to the raw metal from which they had been forged. The seat of absolute power had been unmade not through conquest but through recognition that its time had passed, that the age of kings and queens ruling through fear and force had given way to something gentler and more sustainable. In its place, the lords of Westeros had chosen a different path. selecting their rulers not through inheritance or conquest, but through wisdom and the ability to serve rather than command. The wheel of power still turned, but slowly and gently, guided by hands that understood the weight of responsibility and the importance of humility. Bran the Broken, who sat the throne that was no longer iron, ruled not through force of arms or strength of dragons, but through the accumulated wisdom of ages, his consciousness connected to the great web of memory that bound all living things. Through his eyes, the realm could see the consequences of its choices stretching far into the future, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated in the generations to come. The North had chosen independence, as it had always been meant to do. The descendants of the kings of winter had never truly belonged to the southern kingdom. Their hearts forever turned toward the ancient forests and the old gods who dwelt beyond the wall. Under the rule of Sansa Stark, the North began to heal from the wounds of centuries of war, its people finding peace in the rhythms of season and harvest that had sustained them since the dawn of time. Beyond the wall, in the lands where winter never fully loosened its grip, Jon Snow walked among the free folk as their uncrowned king, though he bore no title and claimed no throne. The wildlings understood what the civilized world often forgot, that true leadership came not from birthright or political maneuvering, but from the willingness to sacrifice oneself for the good of others. In the deep woods, where the heart trees still whispered with the voices of the old gods, Jon served as the bridge between the world of men and the cosmic forces that protected it. He was the guardian of the threshold, ensuring that the balance between ice and fire would be maintained for generations yet to come. The children of the forest emerged from their hidden places, no longer refugees from a world that had forgotten them, but partners in the great work of preservation that would define the new age. Their ancient wisdom, combined with the hard-won knowledge of mortal men, began to weave new patterns of harmony between the natural world and the civilizations that depended upon it. The wall still stood, but its purpose had changed. No longer a barrier against invasion or a prison for ancient evils, it had become a monument to the understanding that some boundaries were necessary not to divide but to protect. The Night's Watch continued their vigil, but they watched now not for enemies but for the subtle signs that would warn of any disturbance in the cosmic balance. In the free cities across the narrow sea, the slaves who had been liberated by the Dragon Queen began to build new lives based on principles of freedom and cooperation rather than exploitation and dominance. The pyramids of Meereen were torn down stone by stone, their materials used to build schools and hospitals, workshops and gardens that would serve the needs of all, rather than the vanity of the few. The Dothraki, no longer bound to the endless cycle of raiding and conquest that had defined their culture for centuries, began to settle into the roles of guardians and protectors, their warrior traditions redirected toward the defense of the peaceful communities that had emerged from the ashes of the old world. In Braavos, the faceless men laid down their blades and opened their halls to those who sought not death but transformation, teaching the arts of change and adaptation that would be needed in the age of renewal. The many-faced god revealed his true nature not as death incarnate, but as the force of transformation that allowed all things to change and grow. The Red Priests of Rule found their temples filling not with those who sought divine favor in war and conquest, but with pilgrims who came to witness the sacred flames that now burned with gentle warmth rather than consuming heat. The Lord of Light had triumphed not through the destruction of his enemies, but through the transformation of conflict into harmony. In the citadel of Old Town, the Maesters began to record not just the histories of kings and battles, but the stories of common people who had found ways to live in peace with their neighbors and their world. The great library expanded to include not just scrolls of ancient lore, but living records of the wisdom that ordinary folk had discovered through trial and error, love and loss. The seasons themselves began to change. their extremes moderated by the restoration of the cosmic balance. The long summers and harsh winters that had defined the world for millennia gave way to gentler cycles, more predictable patterns that allowed agriculture and civilization to flourish without the constant threat of famine or freeze. In the gods' woods of the north, where the heart trees had watched over the realm through all its ages of glory and terror, new saplings began to grow. These young trees carried within their roots the memory of all that had come before, but their branches reached toward a future bright with possibility. The Chronicle of Blood and Prophecy wrote its final words in letters of silver fire, speaking not of destinies yet to be fulfilled, but of peace earned through sacrifice and wisdom gained through suffering. The great pattern that had guided the world through its darkest hours was complete, its purpose achieved through the choices of those who had been willing to put the good of all above their own desires. The book closed itself with a whisper like wind through autumn leaves, its pages sealing once more until such time as the world might need to remember the lessons it contained. But that time, if it ever came, lay in a future so distant that it existed beyond the reach of prophecy or fear. In the gardens of the Red Keep, where once the screams of the tortured had echoed through the night, children played among flowers that bloomed in colors that had no names. Their laughter rang across the city like bells, a sound that spoke of hope and innocence preserved, of futures that stretched ahead like golden pathways leading toward horizons bright with promise. The wheel was broken, the Game of Thrones was ended, and the world had found its way to peace. Not the peace of the grave or the stillness of death, but the living peace of balance and harmony, of growth and change guided by wisdom rather than ambition. The age of dragons was over, but the age of wonder was just beginning. In the gentle light of dawn breaking over a world reborn, the cosmic forces that had shaped destiny for so long settled into their eternal dance, ice and fire, creation and preservation spinning together in perfect harmony. The song of ice and fire had played out to its conclusion, not with the crash of armies or the roar of dragons, but with the gentle whisper of wind through grass, the soft murmur of water over stones, and the quiet breathing of a world at peace. And in that peace, deeper than any that had come before, the future waited with infinite patience for the stories yet to be told, the dreams yet to be dreamed, and the love yet to be born in the hearts of those who would inherit this world renewed. The chronicle was complete, the wheel was broken, and the wheel of time turned on, carrying the world gently toward tomorrows bright with possibility and hope.